My parents called me a thief to every corporate employer in Chicago. For 2 full years, my resume was essentially toxic, a professional death sentence that made certain no one in the industry would even consider giving me a chance. Last week, I sat in what I had convinced myself was just another dead-end interview, bracing myself for yet another polite but firm rejection letter. Then the CEO pulled out a sealed envelope my grandmother had written 10 years ago, and the entire room went completely, breathlessly silent. My name is Rachel. I am 33 years old, and until that exact moment, I genuinely believed my life was completely over. If you have ever been pushed to the absolute edge by the very people who were supposed to love and protect you, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear how I turned a decade-old letter into the ultimate corporate reckoning. The winter wind cutting through Chicago was absolutely brutal the morning I walked into the Pierce Global building. My hands were freezing despite my gloves, but my palms were sweating underneath the lining of my cheap wool coat. Pierce Global was a genuine titan in the logistics industry, their headquarters a towering fortress of glass and steel that dominated the downtown skyline like a monument to power. I stood in the massive marble lobby feeling entirely out of place, like a single cracked tile in an otherwise flawless floor. 2 years ago, I would have walked into a building like this with total confidence, my shoulders squared and my chin lifted. Back then, I was a top-tier supply chain analyst and a ruthless internal auditor. I knew my worth, and I knew my industry inside and out. But 2 years of relentless rejection can break even the strongest, most resilient person. I had been ghosted by dozens of recruiters. I had received countless automated rejection emails that felt more and more like personal condemnations. I was down to the last few $1,000s in my savings account, fighting off eviction notices and eating cheap canned food just to survive one more week. I had applied for a mid-level analyst position at Pierce Global, fully expecting to be interviewed by some junior HR representative in a small, forgettable conference room on the second floor. Instead, the receptionist directed me to the top floor, the executive suite. I had absolutely no idea why Jonathan, the billionaire CEO of the entire corporation, was taking the time to personally interview a desperate candidate for a mid-level job. When the elevator doors slid open on the top floor, a silent, impeccably dressed assistant led me down a long hallway lined with expensive modern art, each piece more imposing than the last. She opened the heavy oak doors to the boardroom and gestured for me to step inside without a word. The room was deeply intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, unobstructed view of Lake Michigan stretching out to the horizon. Sitting at the far end of a massive glass conference table was Jonathan Pierce. He was 55 years old, with sharp features, silver hair, and eyes that looked like they could cut through solid steel without effort. He did not smile when I walked in. He did not offer small talk or ask about my journey to the office. "Sit down, Rachel," he said simply, pointing to the leather chair across from him. His voice was deep and commanding, the kind of voice that filled rooms without needing to rise. I took my seat and kept my posture perfectly straight, more out of pride than composure. I had rehearsed my answers to all the standard interview questions on the train ride over. I was ready to talk about supply chain optimization, vendor management, and financial forecasting. I was ready to demonstrate, once and for all, that I was still the brilliant analyst I had always been. But Jonathan did not open my resume. He did not ask about my skills, my education, or my career trajectory. Instead, he reached into a sleek leather folder and pulled out a single printed email. He slid it deliberately across the smooth glass table until it came to rest directly in front of me. "Read it," he commanded. I looked down at the paper. My heart stopped beating, and every last drop of blood drained from my face. The email had been sent from the official corporate address of Apex Distribution, the medical supply company founded by my late grandmother Beatrice and currently operated by my parents, William and Catherine. I recognized the signature block at the bottom immediately. It was my mother's. I read the words printed on the page and felt a familiar, suffocating wave of panic and humiliation wash over me all at once. To whom it may concern, the email began. We understand Rachel has applied for a position at your firm. It is our unfortunate duty as industry peers to inform you that our daughter Rachel was terminated from Apex Distribution for embezzling $250,000. We chose not to press criminal charges out of familial obligation, but she is a thief. Do not hire her. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. I stared at the piece of paper and felt the air slowly leave my lungs. This was the ghost that had been haunting me for 2 relentless years. This was the reason my career had vanished overnight like smoke. My own parents had not simply fired me. They had actively hunted down every single application I submitted and poisoned the well at every firm in the city. They had blacklisted me across the entire professional landscape of Chicago. I fully expected Jonathan to stand up and instruct security to escort me out of the building. That was exactly what had happened at the last firm where I had managed to secure an interview. But Jonathan just sat there, resting his chin on his steepled fingers, watching me with an expression I could not begin to decipher. Why would a top-tier auditor allow her own parents to completely destroy her career without putting up any kind of fight? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet, almost conversational. Why did you just roll over and let them brand you as a criminal? I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, forcing myself to breathe slowly and steadily. I refused to cry. I had shed every last one of my tears 2 years ago, the night I finally understood that my own family viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle standing between them and their greed. I opened my eyes and looked Jonathan Pierce dead in the face. My jaw tightened, and the fear I had carried into this room like a stone in my chest suddenly evaporated entirely, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard, clarifying rage. Because they owned the servers, Mr. Pierce, I said, my voice surprisingly steady and controlled. I was the lead internal auditor for Apex Distribution. 2 years ago, I was running a routine quarterly reconciliation when I found massive, inexplicable discrepancies in the vendor payout logs. I dug deeper and ran a full forensic audit entirely on my own time, after hours, when no one was watching. Jonathan raised a single eyebrow, waiting for me to continue. What I uncovered was a sophisticated, carefully constructed network of shell companies and phantom vendors. Apex was hemorrhaging cash, but it had nothing to do with market conditions or operational inefficiencies. My parents were cooking the books, I explained, leaning slightly forward. William and Catherine were systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars directly out of the company's operating budget. They were using that money to fund an extraordinarily lavish lifestyle for my younger sister, Madison. I took a breath and kept going. Madison is 29 years old and has never worked a genuinely productive day in her life. But my parents appointed her as the chief financial officer of Apex simply to hand her a massive salary and give her unrestricted access to the corporate credit lines. They were draining the employee pension funds to pay for Madison to buy luxury vehicles and take month-long vacations across Europe as though the money would never run out. I paused, steadying myself as the memory of that night resurfaced. When I confronted my parents with the spreadsheets, they did not apologize. They did not show a single ounce of remorse. My mother looked at me with absolute disgust and told me I was an ungrateful child who clearly did not understand how the real world worked. My father threatened me outright. When I told them I was legally and professionally obligated to report the discrepancies to the IRS, they panicked completely. They locked me out of the building that same night, I continued, my hands gripping the edge of the glass table. They revoked all of my administrative credentials without warning and remotely wiped my hard drive before I could secure physical copies of the audit trails I had compiled. Then they fabricated a series of wire transfers using my old login credentials. They moved $250,000 into a dummy account and framed me for the theft. They told me explicitly that if I ever went to the authorities, they would hand their fabricated evidence over to the police and let me rot in a prison cell. And then they began circulating that email to every logistics and financial firm in the Midwest, ensuring I could never work in this industry again, guaranteeing I would never have the resources or the platform to fight back. Jonathan Pierce did not break eye contact through any of it. He showed no shock, no visible sympathy, and no judgment. He simply absorbed the information with the measured, cold calculation of a man who had built a global empire entirely from scratch. "And you survived for 2 years entirely on your own," he stated, framing it not as a question, but as a recognized fact. "I survived," I replied, lifting my chin. "But I am done merely surviving, Mr. Pierce. If you brought me up here simply to humiliate me with that email, then you have wasted both of our time. I am a brilliant analyst. I can optimize a supply chain more effectively than anyone currently sitting in your department. But if you choose to believe that piece of paper over the truth sitting right in front of you, then I have absolutely nothing left to say to you." I picked up my purse and stood up from the leather chair. I accepted the defeat. I was used to it by now. I turned toward the heavy oak doors, fully prepared to walk back out into the freezing Chicago wind and figure out how I was going to pay my rent the following week. "Sit down, Rachel," Jonathan commanded. I froze halfway to the door. I looked back at him. He had risen from his chair and was walking toward a large mahogany cabinet built flush into the wall behind his desk. "I said sit down," he repeated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument or negotiation. I slowly walked back to the chair and sat down, my heart hammering against my ribs. Jonathan opened the cabinet to reveal a modern digital safe concealed behind the wood paneling. He typed in a long sequence of numbers with practiced precision and pulled the heavy steel door open. "I did not call you up to the executive suite to humiliate you, Rachel," he said, reaching carefully into the safe. "I called you up here because I made a promise to a very formidable woman a very long time ago." He walked back to the conference table and placed an object directly beside the email my parents had written. It was an old, thick envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, soft at the edges from years of sitting untouched. It was sealed shut with a heavy stamp of red wax. I leaned forward, studying the wax seal closely. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized the emblem pressed into the wax immediately. It was the original vintage logo of Apex Distribution, the logo my grandmother Beatrice had personally designed when she launched the company with a single delivery truck 40 years ago. "Your grandmother Beatrice was a force of nature," Jonathan said, looking down at the sealed envelope with unmistakable reverence. "She was a titan in the Chicago business world, respected across the entire industry. She was also one of my earliest mentors when I was just beginning to build Pierce Global. She taught me everything I know about logistics, about integrity, and about the long game." I stared at the envelope, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. My grandmother had passed away 10 years ago. She was the only person in my entire family who had ever truly, unconditionally loved me. She was the one who paid for my accounting degree, who sat with me as a teenager and taught me how to read balance sheets, who sheltered me from my parents' toxic and relentless favoritism toward Madison. When she died suddenly from a stroke, my parents seized control of Apex almost immediately, and from that point forward, my life had descended into a slow, grinding nightmare. "What is this?" I whispered, pointing at the envelope. Your grandmother gave me this 10 years ago, Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a somber, respectful register. It was just a few weeks before she passed. She came to my office in person and handed me this envelope with clear, deliberate instructions. She told me to lock it in my safe. She told me never to open it under any circumstances. And she gave me one single, incredibly specific instruction about what to do with it. He slid the envelope across the glass table until it touched my hands. She told me to keep it sealed until the exact day you walked into my office asking for a job. I have waited 10 years for you to submit an application to Pierce Global, Rachel. I have been quietly tracking your career from a distance. I knew about the blacklist email your parents circulated 2 years ago. I wanted desperately to step in, but Beatrice made me swear on my life to wait until you came to me on your own terms, of your own accord. My hands were shaking as I picked up the envelope. The paper felt both heavy and fragile, like something that had been holding its breath for a decade. Open it, Jonathan commanded quietly. It is time. My fingers worked carefully under the heavy wax seal. The dried red wax snapped with a sharp, clean crack that echoed through the vast boardroom. Inside rested a single piece of thick parchment paper, covered in the elegant, sweeping cursive I had not seen since I was a teenager sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table. My eyes found the top of the page. My dearest Rachel, my grandmother had written, if Jonathan has handed this to you, then you have survived the worst of them. I am writing this letter because I know my son William and his wife Catherine better than they know themselves. I know they are greedy. I know they are incompetent. And most of all, I know they will try to destroy you, because you possess the one thing they utterly and completely lack: integrity. I took a shaky breath and kept reading. Beatrice's handwriting was steady and purposeful, every word chosen with precision. When I built Apex Distribution, I built it on hard work and honest accounting. But William looks at this company not as a legacy worth protecting, but as a personal bank account to drain at will. Catherine encourages his every worst instinct. They favor Madison because she is fundamentally like them, willing to take the shortcuts, willing to flaunt wealth she did not earn and could not sustain on her own. I knew that if I left the company to you directly, they would drag you into probate court for decades. They would bleed you dry with legal fees and manufactured delays. They would use every dirty trick available to strip you of your rightful inheritance. So I decided to play a very different game. A game they are far too short-sighted and too arrogant to ever understand or anticipate. I looked up at Jonathan Pierce. He was leaning back in his leather chair, watching me read with calm, patient attention. He gestured toward the letter with a slight tilt of his chin, urging me to finish. I did not leave the commercial land that Apex Distribution operates on to William. I severed the real estate holding entirely from the operational business entity. I placed 51% of those 30 prime acres into an irrevocable blind trust. Jonathan Pierce is the trustee. You, Rachel, are the sole and absolute beneficiary. William and Catherine own the business, but they do not own the ground they are standing on. You do. Trust Jonathan. Take back what is yours. I set the letter down on the glass table. My mind was spinning, racing through the enormous legal and financial implications of what I had just read. For 10 years, Jonathan said, his deep voice breaking the silence carefully. Your parents have been writing rent checks to the property management division of Pierce Global. They believe this corporation owns the commercial industrial park where Apex Distribution is headquartered. They have no idea that every single dollar of their lease payments has been quietly passing through our accounts and compounding in a private trust bearing your name. You are their landlord, Rachel. I stared at him. The sheer, almost poetic irony of it struck me with the force of a freight train moving at full speed. My parents had spent 2 years dragging my name through the mud across an entire city. They had called me a thief. They had blacklisted me and blackmailed me, forced me to eat canned soup and dodge eviction notices, stripped me of every professional relationship I had built over a decade. All while they were physically sitting inside a building that I technically owned. They had been paying me rent while simultaneously trying to starve me out of existence. Your grandmother was an extraordinarily brilliant strategist, Jonathan continued, leaning forward and resting his arms on the table. She understood that William would eventually run the operational side of Apex into the ground. She knew with certainty that he lacked the discipline, the judgment, and the work ethic to sustain a supply chain business in the modern market. She designed this arrangement specifically to ensure that when the operational business inevitably collapsed, the underlying real assets, the land, the zoning rights, the physical infrastructure, would remain completely untouched and safely in your possession. "How much is in the trust account?" I asked, my voice dropping to a near whisper. Jonathan opened a separate black folder and slid a single sheet of paper toward me. It was a certified bank statement from Pierce Global Wealth Management. I looked at the bottom line. The balance was staggering. 10 years of commercial rent payments, compounded through aggressive index fund investments, had grown into a fortune I could not have imagined while eating canned soup in my drafty apartment. I went from having $14 in my checking account to looking at an 8-figure liquid asset portfolio. "But the cash is just the beginning," Jonathan said, his expression turning deadly serious. "This brings us to the current situation. Your parents are completely out of money, Rachel. The lavish lifestyle they have been financing for Madison has finally, inevitably, caught up with them. The shell companies you discovered during your internal audit 2 years ago were never more than a temporary band-aid over a hemorrhaging wound. Apex Distribution is currently experiencing a catastrophic liquidity crisis." He pulled out another stack of documents stamped with bright red ink. "Delinquency notices," he explained. "Apex has missed their last 3 consecutive rent payments. They are 90 days past due on their commercial lease. By every legal definition, they are in default." I picked up the notices. My professional instincts fired immediately. If they are in default on a commercial lease of this size, they must be missing vendor payouts as well. The entire supply chain must be unraveling. "It is," Jonathan confirmed, "but William believes he has found a way out. He has been calling my office non-stop for the past month. He is desperate. He wants to purchase the land outright from Pierce Global, to buy the ground out from under us." I frowned. That makes no sense. If they cannot cover their monthly rent, how could they possibly finance the acquisition of 30 acres of prime Chicago industrial real estate? "Because they found an outside buyer," Jonathan said, a cold, precise smile touching the corners of his mouth. "The entire industrial corridor surrounding Apex is being gentrified rapidly. A major commercial developer is moving aggressively to acquire the entire block in order to build a high-end technology campus. William negotiated a backdoor arrangement with the developers. He intends to purchase the land from Pierce Global for $5 million using a high-interest bridge loan, and then flip that exact same land to the developers the following day for $15 million. He wants to pocket a $10 million profit," I said, grasping the full audacity of my father's scheme. "He wants to use that money to plug the massive hole he and Catherine have created in the company accounts, and to cover up the tax fraud before the IRS finally notices the missing pension funds." "Exactly," Jonathan confirmed. "William believes I am simply a distracted CEO who views that land as a minor line item on a sprawling corporate balance sheet. He thinks he can bully or smooth-talk my real estate division into a quick, quiet sale. He thinks Pierce Global will simply sign over the deed to be rid of a delinquent tenant." Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket and placed a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen on top of the delinquency notices. Then he slid the master deed of the property across the table toward me. I am the trustee, he said, his gaze locking directly onto mine. But you are the sole beneficiary, and you are now 33 years old. According to the bylaws of the trust, you are fully of age to assume direct, unshielded legal control of the assets. If you pick up that pen and sign these documents, we remove the blindfold permanently. You become the direct public legal owner of the Apex Distribution headquarters. I stared at the gold pen. The metal gleamed under the harsh boardroom lights. You can initiate eviction proceedings tomorrow morning, Jonathan said, his voice steady and resolute. You can order the sheriffs to lock the doors and freeze their entire operation. You can deny the land sale to the developers and let William and Catherine drown slowly in the debt they spent years creating. You can end everything they have built. With a single signature, Rachel. I reached out and let my fingertips rest against the cool metal of the pen. For 2 years, I had dreamed obsessively about revenge. I had imagined 100 different ways to make my parents pay for what they had deliberately done to me. I had endured freezing nights in a rundown apartment, crying myself to sleep because my own family had branded me a criminal and erased me from the professional world. The power to destroy them was quite literally at my fingertips, cold and certain as the pen beneath them. Then my phone buzzed sharply in my coat pocket. The vibration shattered the heavy silence of the boardroom like a stone thrown through glass. I pulled the phone out. The screen lit up with a new text message. It was from Madison. My spoiled, entitled sister almost never contacted me unless she wanted to rub her manufactured wealth in my face or extract some kind of favor. I opened the message. Thanksgiving dinner is at the main house this Thursday, Madison had written. Mom said you can come, but only if you use the back entrance. We need someone to help the catering staff wash dishes after the actual family finishes eating. Don't wear those cheap clothes you had on last time. Brad's family will be there, and we can't have you looking like a homeless person. I stared at the glowing screen for a long moment. Madison was engaged to Brad, a wealthy but deeply superficial man from a prominent family. She was hosting Thanksgiving to perform her fake success for an audience. She wanted me there as the punchline to her evening, the unemployed, disgraced sister in the worn coat, washing dishes in the kitchen while the real family dined in the warmth of the living room. I slowly placed the phone face up on the glass table. I looked at the text message. Then I looked at the gold pen. Then I looked up at Jonathan Pierce. I pushed the pen back across the table. Are you declining the trust? Jonathan asked, his brow furrowing with genuine confusion. No, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. I am accepting every single asset my grandmother left me, but I am not signing those papers today. Jonathan leaned back and crossed his arms. Explain. Ending them with a piece of paper from a boardroom is too easy, I said, standing up from the chair. My posture was rigid and straight. The defeated, desperate woman who had walked into this office an hour ago was gone. In her place stood the rightful owner of a multi-million-dollar estate. If I evict them tomorrow, they will immediately construct a new lie. They will tell everyone at their country club that a greedy corporation forced them out. They will position themselves as victims. They will hide behind their performance of wealth and pretend it was simply a business tragedy beyond their control. I picked up my coat and slipped it on deliberately. I am going to that Thanksgiving dinner, Mr. Pierce, I said, looking down at the legal documents spread across the table. My parents and my sister love to put on a show. They crave an audience more than anything else. So I am going to give them exactly what they want. I am going to let them sit at the head of the table. I am going to let them boast about their success. I am going to let them believe, completely and comfortably, that they have won. A slow, calculating smile spread across Jonathan's face. He understood exactly what I was building toward. I want to look them in the eyes, I said, buttoning my coat with steady hands. when the ground collapses completely beneath their feet. I want to watch them dig their own graves in front of every single person they are trying to impress. Prepare the transfer documents, Mr. Pierce. I will be back to sign them next week. But first, I have a holiday dinner to attend. Driving up the long, winding driveway of my parents' suburban estate in Oak Brook always felt like entering a carefully constructed alternate reality. The massive wrought iron gates swung open to reveal a meticulously manicured lawn that cost more to maintain in a single month than I had earned in the past 2 years. I parked my rusted 10-year-old sedan at the very edge of the cobblestone driveway, deliberately keeping it buried in the shadows, as far as possible from the gleaming luxury vehicles lined up near the grand front steps like a display of everything I was supposed to envy. I stepped out into the freezing November air and pulled my thin wool coat tighter around my shoulders. The front door burst open before I even reached the porch. Madison stood framed by the warm golden light of the grand foyer, holding a crystal champagne flute with practiced ease. She wore a stunning emerald silk designer dress that clung to every carefully sculpted line of her figure. Behind her, the sprawling house buzzed with the loud, self-congratulatory laughter of people who had convinced themselves their wealth made them permanently untouchable. Madison did not offer a greeting or a welcoming smile. She pointed her champagne flute toward the center of the driveway instead. "You parked too far away, Rachel," she said, taking a long, slow, deliberate sip. "You almost missed the main attraction." I followed her gaze. Sitting in the most prominent spot in the circular driveway, under the full glare of the exterior floodlights, was a brand new Porsche Panamera. The paint was a deep metallic black that seemed to swallow the light around it entirely. The temporary dealer tags were still taped to the windshield. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Madison asked, her voice dripping with practiced entitlement. "A little reward to myself. A CFO bonus for closing out a spectacular quarter at Apex Distribution. Dad said my financial restructuring saved the company from a major operational slump, so he authorized the payout immediately." I looked at the car without expression. A $120,000 luxury vehicle bought by a 29-year-old woman who could not read a basic balance sheet without the assistance of a calculator. 2 years ago, I was the one doing the actual financial restructuring. I was the one finding the massive, bleeding leaks in the operational budget and staying up through the night to trace them to their source. Now the company was 90 days delinquent on their commercial lease and careening toward total eviction, while my sister stood here bragging about a cash bonus drawn from accounts that were already running dry. I heard the measured crunch of footsteps on the frost-covered walkway. Jamal stepped out from the shadows of the wraparound porch. Jamal was Madison's husband, 31 years old, a brilliantly sharp tax attorney who always carried himself with a quiet, composed dignity that felt entirely out of place in the middle of my loud, performative family. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and held a simple glass of sparkling water. Jamal never drank alcohol at these family gatherings. I had long suspected he simply needed a completely clear head to navigate the relentless minefield of microaggressions my parents lobbed in his direction throughout every dinner. "Good evening, Rachel," Jamal said, his deep, resonant voice cutting cleanly through Madison's performance. "I am glad you could make it." He extended a hand and I shook it. His grip was firm and grounding. He glanced at my thin coat, then at the freezing wind whipping around us. "Let us get you inside," he said quietly. "It is far too cold to be standing out here." Madison rolled her eyes with theatrical exhaustion. "Don't coddle her, Jamal. She is used to the cold. I mean, look at that coat. Did you buy that at a charity thrift store, Rachel? I thought I told you Brad's parents were coming tonight. We cannot have you looking like a charity case in front of his family." I did not take the bait. I simply walked past her and stepped into the grand foyer. The overwhelming heat of the mansion enveloped me instantly. The rich, layered smell of roasted turkey and expensive imported spices filled the air. My mother, Catherine, was standing in the center of the massive chef's kitchen, directing a team of hired caterers with the ruthless, clipped efficiency of a general commanding troops. She wore a stunning velvet gown and a diamond necklace that caught the light sharply with every movement of her head. She turned and saw me standing in the hallway. Her face immediately contorted into a mask of pure, undisguised disgust. "You are late," Catherine snapped, marching toward me. "And what on earth are you wearing? I made sure Madison communicated the formal dress code to you explicitly." I took off my coat, revealing a simple but clean black dress. "It is appropriate for a holiday dinner," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and calm. Catherine snatched the coat from my hands and tossed it onto a nearby chair with a sharp huff of irritation. "It looks cheap," she hissed, leaning in close so the catering staff would not hear her venomous tone. "Brad's family comes from old money, Rachel. They own half the commercial real estate in this city. I will not have my disgraced unemployed daughter making us look like commoners in our own home. Take this." She shoved a stiff white linen apron firmly against my chest. "Since you insist on showing up and eating our food, the very least you can do is make yourself useful. The catering staff is overwhelmed. Take the trays of caviar appetizers and serve them in the main living room. Keep your head down, do not strike up conversations with the guests, and for heaven's sake, do not breathe a word about your employment situation to anyone. If someone asks, you are doing consulting work abroad." I looked down at the white apron in my hands. 10 years ago, my grandmother Beatrice had built this family empire from absolutely nothing. One delivery truck, one honest deal at a time. She had taught me that true, lasting power is always quiet. She had taught me that people who feel a desperate need to degrade others are almost always attempting to conceal a massive, catastrophic weakness of their own. I thought about the legal documents locked in Jonathan Pierce's steel safe. I thought about the eviction notices stamped in bright red. I thought about the $15 million land deal my parents were scrambling desperately to close in order to save themselves from total public bankruptcy. I took the apron from my mother's hands and tied it carefully around my waist. "I will serve the appetizers," I said, offering her a polite, utterly empty smile. Catherine looked momentarily stunned by my complete compliance. She had fully expected a fight, had been counting on a screaming match she could use to banish me into the snow and then play the grieving, reasonable mother for her wealthy guests. When I simply agreed, she scoffed, turned on her designer heel, and marched back into the kitchen barking orders at a terrified waiter. I lifted a heavy silver tray loaded with intricate caviar bites and walked steadily into the main living room. The space was packed with wealthy guests holding crystal glasses and talking loudly over one another in the easy, careless way of people who have never once worried about paying rent. My father, William, stood commanding the fireplace, holding court with Brad's parents. He wore a custom-tailored suit and gestured expansively as he described his latest luxury golf trip in exquisite detail. "Ah, the appetizers," William announced loudly as I approached their circle, without looking at me. He did not acknowledge me. He did not introduce me to his guests. He treated me with the casual indifference of someone addressing a hired servant, which, for this evening, was exactly what I was allowing him to believe I was. I held the tray steady as Brad's mother, a woman draped in expensive silk, her posture immaculate, selected a small pastry without making eye contact with me. "Your catering staff is very attentive, William," she murmured, turning back to my father. "So, tell me more about these expansion plans for Apex Distribution. My husband mentioned you were looking at acquiring significant new warehouse space. Are you positioning the company for a major acquisition phase?" "Absolutely," William boasted, taking a long, confident sip of his premium bourbon. "We have secured massive capital reserves, My CFO, Madison, has completely streamlined our operational budget this year. The profit margins this quarter are unprecedented. I held the silver tray perfectly steady and kept my expression completely neutral. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I simply stood there, in my white linen apron, and let him talk. We have more liquid cash than we know what to do with. I stood there holding the heavy silver tray, listening to my father lie through his teeth with absolute, practiced perfection. Apex Distribution was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate. They were drowning in insurmountable compounding debt. They were 90 days behind on their commercial rent and running out of time. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his lies was almost impressive in its boldness. From across the room, I felt someone watching me. I turned my head slightly and met Jamal's gaze. He was standing near the grand mahogany staircase, holding his glass of water, his dark and intelligent eyes tracking every single movement in the room with quiet, methodical precision. Jamal was a brilliant tax attorney. He spent his long, demanding days analyzing complex financial structures, finding obscure tax loopholes buried in dense federal code, and reading corporate balance sheets the way most people read novels. He was professionally, almost obsessively trained to spot inconsistencies. And the inconsistencies piling up inside this sprawling, glittering mansion were accumulating faster than anyone realized. Jamal watched as Madison paraded through the living room, dangling the shiny new keys to her Porsche in front of anyone willing to look. He watched as William bragged loudly about unprecedented profit margins to wide-eyed investors. He watched as Catherine viciously berated the catering staff for pouring the wrong vintage of wine, her voice a sharp, controlled hiss beneath the noise of the party. And he watched me. He saw how I carried the serving tray with quiet, unshakable dignity, refusing to break under the crushing, humiliating weight of my parents' very public performance. He knew I had been a top-tier auditor. He knew I possessed a relentless, almost obsessive mind for numbers and an unwavering devotion to accurate data. 2 years ago, when my parents first accused me of embezzling $250,000, Jamal had stayed quiet. He had just married into the family and did not want to ignite a massive, irreparable rift. But I always suspected he never fully believed their conveniently timed story. The math simply did not add up to a man who lived and breathed the rigid precision of financial law. I continued moving through the crowded, overheated room, serving appetizers and listening to the arrogant, self-congratulatory chatter swirling around me. Madison intercepted me near the hallway leading to the dining room. She grabbed a caviar bite from my tray and chewed it slowly, looking me up and down with undisguised, calculated malice. "You know, you actually look good in an apron, Rachel," she mocked, her voice laced with a particular brand of venom she had been perfecting since childhood. "It really suits your station in life. Maybe I can speak to the catering company and arrange a full-time position for you scraping plates in the kitchen. You desperately need the money, right? I hear your landlord has been threatening eviction again." I maintained my perfectly neutral expression, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she so clearly craved. "I am doing just fine, Madison," I said, my voice smooth and unhurried. "But thank you sincerely for your concern. Enjoy the new Porsche. I hope the expensive maintenance schedule does not cut too deeply into your fictional CFO bonus." Madison's eyes flashed with a sudden, intense surge of anger, but she quickly smoothed her features back into practiced composure as Brad walked up behind her and wrapped his arms possessively around her waist. Brad was a venture capitalist, a man whose entire personality was constructed around the comfortable foundation of his massive trust fund. He looked at me with an amused, condescending smirk that he had clearly spent years refining. "Still looking for work, Rachel?" he asked, his tone thick with heavy condescension. "Let me know if you need me to make some calls. I know a few low-level temp agencies that specialize in placing people with, shall we say, challenging criminal backgrounds. They mostly handle data entry work, but it is a paycheck at the end of the month. I smiled tightly, gripping the edges of the silver tray. I appreciate the offer, Brad, I said. But I have recently secured a very promising new position. In fact, my new role will involve restructuring some rather significant commercial real estate assets right here in Chicago. Brad laughed warmly, clearly missing the precise loaded threat embedded beneath my words. Good for you, he said, already turning his attention back to Madison. Come on, babe, your dad is opening the expensive wine in the dining room. As Brad led Madison away, she turned sharply on her heel. The sudden movement caused her designer handbag to swing outward, brushing hard against the edge of a heavy marble console table. The gold clasp caught on the sharp stone corner and snapped violently open. A handful of items tumbled out and clattered loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. Lipstick, a compact mirror, a silver card holder, and several crumpled pieces of paper, scattering in every direction. Madison cursed under her breath and dropped to her knees to gather her things. Jamal, who had been moving quietly toward the dining room, immediately stepped forward to help his wife. I stood a few feet away, still holding my silver tray, watching the interaction unfold with intense, focused attention. Jamal reached down to retrieve a crumpled white receipt that had fluttered close to his expensive leather shoes. The moment his long fingers brushed the paper, he froze completely. I watched his dark eyes dart rapidly across the printed text. I watched his jaw clench so tightly that a muscle jumped visibly in his cheek. I watched the exact terrifying moment his brilliant analytical mind connected the scattered, damning pieces of a catastrophic puzzle. Madison snatched the compact mirror and the lipstick, shoving them aggressively back into her bag. "Give me that, Jamal," she snapped, extending her hand impatiently for the receipt. Jamal did not hand it over immediately. He stared at the piece of paper, his thumb slowly tracing the printed corporate logo pressed at the very top. His expression was completely unreadable, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. "What exactly is this, Madison?" Jamal asked, his deep voice stripped entirely of warmth and softened of all its usual ease. "It is just a receipt for the car," she said, her voice pitching slightly higher than normal, betraying the sudden panic rising beneath her composed surface. "Just give it to me, please." I watched Jamal's eyes scan the paper a second time, slower and more deliberate. I knew precisely what he was looking at. The receipt was not a standard personal dealership invoice. It was a corporate charge authorization. Madison had not purchased the Porsche with a personal bank check or a conventional auto loan. She had charged a $120,000 luxury sports car directly to the primary operational credit line of Apex Distribution, a medical supply company whose employees' pension funds were already being quietly drained. For a federal tax attorney, this was not merely a red flag. It was a blazing, deafening alarm signaling severe and deliberate corporate fraud. Purchasing a personal luxury vehicle with company funds and disguising it as a legitimate CFO bonus was a profound violation of federal tax codes. It was textbook embezzlement, the precise financial crime my parents had accused me of committing 2 years ago to divert suspicion from their own methodical looting. Jamal slowly handed the receipt back to his wife. His dark eyes lifted from the crumpled paper and locked directly, deliberately onto my face across the crowded room. I stood perfectly still, holding the catering tray, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. The silence stretching between us cut cleanly through the noise of the party. In that single, defining moment, Jamal understood the absolute, unvarnished truth. He looked at his wife bragging about fabricated wealth. He looked at my parents boasting about invented profits to investors who trusted them. And then he looked at me, the disgraced, exiled sister quietly serving appetizers in a worn black dress. He knew. He finally knew with complete certainty that I had not stolen a single dollar from Apex Distribution 2 years ago. He understood that I had uncovered the deep, spreading rot in the company ledgers, and that my parents had methodically framed me to bury their own massive financial crimes beneath my ruined reputation. Jamal rose slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal suit with deliberate precision. He looked at me one final time, a silent, charged communication passing clearly between us, across the noise and glitter of the party. He had seen through the entire carefully maintained facade. He knew the family empire was built on a crumbling mountain of fraud and fabrication. And as I watched him turn and walk quietly toward the dining room, away from his panicking wife, I understood with absolute certainty that I had just found the one powerful, credible ally capable of helping me bring the entire operation crashing irrevocably to the ground. The delicate clinking of expensive crystal and the low, self-satisfied hum of arrogant conversation filled the sprawling dining room. I remained at my assigned post near the swinging kitchen doors, holding the empty silver catering tray against my hip, watching. I observed Jamal take his seat beside Madison. His face was a masterclass in total, impenetrable composure. Not a single muscle betrayed the explosive realization he had just quietly absorbed in the grand foyer. He simply unfolded his pristine linen napkin and placed it with measured care across his lap. His dark, perceptive eyes occasionally tracked William at the head of the table, studying the patriarch with the methodical, clinical detachment of a federal prosecutor carefully assembling his case. The Thanksgiving meal itself was a grotesque, almost theatrical display of excess and manufactured wealth. Caterers rushed back and forth carrying massive silver platters of roasted turkey, truffle mashed potatoes, and imported wine poured from bottles that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budgets. I stood in the shadowed archway of the dining room, doing precisely what my mother had ordered. I kept my head down. I watched my family gorge themselves on food purchased with fraudulent corporate credit lines. William held court at the head of the table, holding Brad and his wealthy parents in rapt attention as he boasted about imaginary warehouse acquisitions and projected fourth-quarter revenues that existed nowhere but in his own fabrications. Madison sat beside Brad, absently twisting her enormous diamond engagement ring and complaining loudly about the heavy personal tax burden of being a highly compensated corporate executive. Catherine performed the role of perfect high society hostess with polished, practiced ease, smiling sweetly at the guests while directing the hired help with sharp, dismissive flicks of her manicured fingers. Nobody offered me a plate. Nobody asked if I wanted a glass of water. I was entirely and deliberately invisible to them, useful only so long as I was carrying something. When the dessert plates were finally cleared and the wealthy guests began drifting toward the parlor for after-dinner drinks, Catherine suddenly materialized at my side. Her performance-perfect smile vanished the instant we were out of eyesight of Brad's parents. She grabbed my upper arm with fingers like a vice, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin through the thin fabric of my dress. "Put the tray down," she hissed, her breath carrying the sharp edge of expensive champagne. "Go to your father's private study, right now. Do not speak to anyone on your way there." I gently removed my arm from her grip and placed the silver tray on the nearest counter. I smoothed the front of my dress without rushing. I did not ask questions. I simply turned and walked down the long, dimly lit corridor leading to the west wing of the estate. William's private study was designed to project the image of a self-made billionaire with boundless intellectual depth. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves packed with leather-bound volumes he had clearly never opened. A massive Persian rug covered the hardwood floor. At the center of the room sat an imposing antique mahogany desk, its surface dark and polished to a mirror shine. The air was heavy with the smell of aged scotch and expensive cigar smoke. a curated atmosphere of power and impunity. I stepped inside. William was already seated behind his desk. Catherine followed me in and pushed the heavy oak doors shut behind her. I heard the distinct metallic click of the brass lock engaging. I was officially cornered. "Sit down, Rachel," William ordered, pointing to one of the rigid leather chairs positioned directly across from his desk. He did not sound angry. He sounded falsely benevolent, measured, paternalistic, and calculated, which was infinitely more dangerous than open rage. I remained standing. "I prefer to stand," I said, keeping my voice flat and even. "What do you want?" William sighed heavily, rubbing his temples with the theatrical weariness of a man dealing with a stubborn child. He opened a sleek leather folder on his desk and withdrew a stack of crisp legal documents, aligning the edges with methodical, deliberate precision. "Your mother and I have been giving your situation a great deal of thought," he began, his voice dripping with fabricated paternal concern. "We understand the last 2 years have been incredibly difficult for you. We know you have been struggling to find meaningful employment. We know you are barely scraping by in that small condo downtown." I stared at him. The sheer, staggering audacity of his words was almost difficult to absorb. I was struggling precisely because they had systematically blacklisted me across the entire professional landscape of Chicago. They had intentionally and methodically starved me out of the corporate sector with a single, well-circulated email. "We want to help you," Catherine chimed in, moving to stand directly behind William's leather chair. She placed her hands on his shoulders and offered me a sickeningly warm smile. "You are our daughter, after all. We do not want to see you living in poverty." "Cut the performance," I said sharply, crossing my arms over my chest. "You locked the door. You brought out legal documents. You are not here to help me. You want something specific from me. Tell me what it is so I can leave." William's counterfeit smile vanished completely. His eyes hardened and turned cold, transactional, businesslike. He slid the stack of legal papers across the polished mahogany surface toward the edge of the desk. "Apex Distribution is undergoing a brief business expansion," William stated, his tone shifting smoothly into his aggressive corporate negotiating register. "We are finalizing a significant acquisition deal next week that will double our operational capacity. However, because the expansion is moving so quickly, we face a temporary liquidity gap. We need a short-term bridge loan to finalize the paperwork." I looked down at the documents sitting on the edge of the desk. I did not need to pick them up. I was a former top-tier supply chain analyst and a highly trained auditor. I could read a standard commercial collateral agreement upside down from 3 feet away. "You want my condo?" I said, my voice dropping to a low, disbelieving near whisper. "It is simply a temporary collateral assignment," Catherine said quickly, waving her hand as though swatting away a minor inconvenience. "We just need to pledge the deed of your downtown property to a private lender to secure the bridge loan. We will release the lien within 6 months, once the expansion capital begins flowing. You will barely notice a difference, and in exchange, we will provide you with a generous monthly stipend so you can stop scrambling for freelance work." I stared at the two of them in complete silence for a long moment. The sheer, almost surreal absurdity of the situation temporarily robbed me of words. I had purchased that small, modest one-bedroom condo 5 years ago with my own carefully saved earnings. It was the only tangible asset I had managed to protect when my parents launched their systematic campaign to erase me. I had survived on ramen noodles and skipped meals just to ensure I never missed a single mortgage payment. And now these two people, standing in a multi-million-dollar mansion, surrounded by luxury vehicles and high society guests, were calmly asking me to surrender the only roof remaining over my head. A sound rose from my throat. I tried to suppress it and could not. I threw my head back and laughed. A cold, genuine, unrestrained laugh that bounced off the mahogany walls and filled every corner of the study. I laughed until my chest physically ached. I looked at the two multimillionaires across from me, begging their unemployed, blacklisted daughter for a real estate handout, and I laughed harder. William slammed his fist down on the desk with enough force to make the heavy crystal ashtray rattle against the polished surface. "This is not a joke, Rachel," he roared, his face flushing a deep, furious red. "We are offering you a genuine lifeline. You are offering me an anchor to tie around my neck before you throw me into the river." I shot back, the laughter draining instantly from my voice. "You are sitting in a $10 million estate. Madison is driving a brand new Porsche Panamera. You just fed 50 people imported caviar and black truffles. And you are asking the daughter you deliberately blacklisted across an entire city for the deed to a 400-square-foot condo." I stepped closer to the desk and leaned over the stack of legal documents, closing the physical distance between us entirely. I did not raise my voice. "You do not have a brief business expansion underway, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, airless room like a blade. "You have a catastrophic cash flow crisis. The shell companies are drying up. The private lenders have cut you off. You cannot secure a traditional bank loan because any legitimate loan officer who reviewed your actual balance sheets would immediately contact the authorities. You are completely and irreversibly out of money." Catherine's face twisted into a mask of pure, vicious fury. The sweet maternal performance dissolved entirely. She stepped out from behind the desk and marched directly up to my face. "You ungrateful, arrogant little wretch!" she snarled, her voice dropping to a venomous, trembling hiss. "You will sign those papers right now. You owe us everything. We raised you. We fed you. We funded your entire existence." "I paid for my own college tuition," I fired back, refusing to retreat a single inch. "And I paid for my own condo with my own money. You gave me nothing but a target on my back and a forged wire transfer." Catherine's eyes widened with manic, barely contained fury. She pointed a sharp, trembling finger directly at my chest. "If you do not pick up that pen and sign the collateral agreement right now, I will make your current life look like a peaceful vacation," she threatened, her voice shaking with raw, desperate malice. "I know exactly who your current landlord is. I will call him tomorrow morning and tell him you are a convicted thief under active federal investigation for embezzlement. I will have you thrown onto the freezing street before the end of the week. I will permanently destroy your credit rating. I will make absolutely certain you starve in the gutters of this city." William rose from his leather chair, towering over the desk, his fists clenched rigidly at his sides. "You have no leverage here, Rachel," he barked. "You are nobody. You have no job, no professional reputation, and no power. We are handing you an opportunity to be useful to this family for the first time in your entire miserable life. You should be grateful. You should be on your knees thanking us for offering you a way back into our good graces. Sign the document." I looked at my mother, whose face had twisted into an expression of undisguised hatred. I looked at my father, whose chest heaved with short, desperate, furious breaths. They genuinely believed they held every card. They genuinely believed they had backed me into a corner from which there was no escape. I slowly placed both hands flat on the polished mahogany surface of William's desk. I leaned my weight forward, closing the distance between us. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I looked my father dead in the eyes with absolute, terrifying, immovable calm. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, quiet whisper. "And you should be extremely careful making threats you cannot afford to back up, Dad." William sneered, showing his teeth. "I can afford to destroy you 10 times over." "Can you?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Because an hour ago, I watched Madison drop a corporate charge receipt on the hardwood floor of your own hallway. A receipt for a $120,000 luxury vehicle charged directly to the operational budget of Apex Distribution. William stopped breathing. The furious red flush on his face drained away in an instant, replaced by a sickly ashen gray. Catherine took a sudden stumbling step backward, her high heels catching on the edge of the Persian rug. I held my father's terrified gaze and refused to let him look away. "You might want to seriously reconsider your aggressive business strategies, Dad," I said, my voice echoing softly in the absolute dead silence of the study. Because the IRS tends to audit rather aggressively any company that classifies a luxury Porsche as a standard office supply. William turned ghost white. His mouth fell open, but no sound came. The powerful, intimidating patriarch had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, exposed fraud staring down the barrel of a loaded gun he had handed to someone else. I did not wait for William to recover his voice, or for Catherine to regain her balance. I simply turned on my heel and walked out through the heavy oak doors, leaving them suffocating in the toxic, stale air of their own undoing. The satisfying, resonant click of the brass lock disengaging behind me felt like a starting pistol firing into the cold night sky. The war was officially underway, and they had absolutely no idea how catastrophically outgunned they truly were. While I was delivering my ultimatum in the West Wing, another quiet and equally devastating confrontation was unfolding in the grand hallway. Jamal had not returned to the dining room to finish his meal. He stood instead in the shadowed alcove near the lavish coat check, the crumpled white receipt burning a figurative hole through the lining of his tailored suit pocket. Jamal was a man who had built his entire existence on strict rules, rigid structures, and absolute adherence to the precise letter of federal statutes. Growing up as a black man in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, he had learned very early and very clearly that the margin of error available to someone who looked like him was effectively non-existent. He had been required to be twice as sharp, 3 times as careful, and infinitely more disciplined than his peers to break into the fiercely competitive, largely insular circles of corporate tax law. He understood with bone-deep clarity the devastating personal cost of a single significant financial misstep. He knew the catastrophic, life-altering power of an IRS audit initiated for the right reasons. And right now, the small, crumpled piece of paper resting in his pocket represented a federal crime printed clearly in black ink. Madison came strutting down the hallway, her emerald silk dress swishing aggressively around her legs. She was frantically retracing her steps, her eyes darting nervously across the polished hardwood floor, her breathing shallow and accelerated. Jamal stepped out of the dark alcove, his tall, composed frame entirely blocking her path to the grand foyer. "Looking for this, Madison?" he asked, holding the crumpled receipt precisely between his index and middle fingers. Madison gasped, her hand flying theatrically to her chest in a display of relief. "Oh, thank goodness you found it," she said, reaching out quickly to snatch the paper from his grip. "I must have dropped it when my bag hit the table. Give it to me." Jamal did not hand it over. Instead, he pulled his hand back and raised the paper to his eye level. His dark, intelligent eyes locked onto his wife's face with a chilling, evaluative intensity. "This is a corporate charge authorization, Madison," Jamal said, his deep voice stripped clean of all warmth. "For a $120,000 luxury sports car charged directly to the operational supply budget of Apex Distribution. You did not purchase this car with a personal bonus payment. You bought it using company funds." Madison rolled her eyes and released a loud, dramatic sigh of exasperated irritation. She crossed her arms, tapping her designer heel impatiently against the floorboards. "It is a CFO bonus, Jamal," she snapped, her voice climbing higher with defensive arrogance. Dad personally authorized the payout. Stop behaving like a paranoid low-level auditor. You clearly do not understand how real corporate wealth operates. We move capital around continuously to maximize our tax advantages. It is entirely legal. Jamal felt a muscle contract tightly in his jaw. The sheer, blinding ignorance embedded in her statement was staggering to absorb from a woman whose name appeared on the corporate ledger. You cannot disguise a personal luxury vehicle as a legitimate corporate operational expense to avoid capital gains and luxury taxes, Jamal explained, speaking with the slow, measured clarity of someone explaining a basic and dangerous principle to a person who had chosen not to understand it. If the IRS flags this specific transaction, and they will not classify it as a creative accounting decision. They will classify it as willful, intentional embezzlement. You are the chief financial officer of the company, Madison. Your personal signature appears on the corporate ledger. You will be the one facing federal indictment, not your father. You are being completely and utterly ridiculous, Madison hissed, her face flushing an ugly, mottled shade of red. Dad knows exactly what he is doing. He has a full team of accountants who manage all of the paperwork. Just give me the receipt and go back to the party before you ruin everyone's evening. Before Jamal could respond to her dismissal, heavy, aggressive footsteps echoed down the hallway. William, fresh from the study and seething with barely contained, explosive rage from my earlier confrontation, stormed toward them. His face was still a dangerous shade of crimson, his fists clenched rigidly at his sides. He saw Jamal holding the receipt and marched immediately into Jamal's personal space, attempting to use his physical bulk to intimidate his son-in-law into submission. "Is there a problem here?" William barked, his voice laced with the particular brand of venomous authority he deployed when he felt his control slipping. "Why are you harassing my daughter in the middle of our holiday gathering?" Jamal did not move a single inch backward. He stood his ground, looking at his father-in-law with absolute, unwavering composure that William had no framework to counter. "I am asking my wife why she is committing federal tax fraud to finance a sports car," Jamal stated evenly, holding the receipt up with deliberate calm. "This purchase is a direct and clear violation of the corporate tax code. If the authorities audit Apex Distribution, Madison will be held personally and legally liable for the misappropriation of corporate funds. I am attempting to protect her from a federal prison sentence." William snatched the receipt from Jamal's hand and crushed it into a tight ball in his fist. He glared at Jamal, his eyes filled with a toxic compound of class contempt, racism, and the pure, unfiltered arrogance of a man who had never once been genuinely held accountable. "You listen to me very carefully," William snarled, stepping close enough that Jamal could detect the sharp, sour smell of expensive bourbon on his breath. "You are a tax attorney, Jamal. You are a paper pusher. You bill by the hour to clean up the messes of men like me. You sit in a small office and highlight legal texts because you lack the actual stomach for high-level, aggressive business maneuvering." Jamal remained perfectly, deliberately silent, absorbing the insult with a stone-still expression, allowing William to expose every layer of his true character without interruption. "In this family, we make real money," William continued, jabbing a thick finger hard against Jamal's chest. "We build lasting empires. We do not cower in fear over bureaucratic red tape and regulatory technicalities. Do not presume to question my daughter's financial decisions simply because your working-class background has conditioned you to be terrified of calculated risk. You married into an entirely different world. You get to wear expensive suits and sit at this table because I permit it. Learn your proper place in this house, or pack your bags and go back to whichever neighborhood you came from." The racial and class-based contempt landed precisely as William had intended it. It was a deliberate, unmistakable reminder that William viewed Jamal not as a son-in-law, not as Madison's equal partner, but as a convenient prop. A respectable, highly credentialed black man, they could display to signal their progressive social sensibilities, while privately regarding him as entirely beneath them. Jamal slowly turned his head and looked at Madison. He waited for his wife to step forward. He waited for her to defend their marriage, to reprimand her father for the blatant and ugly disrespect he had just displayed in the open hallway of their family home. He waited for the woman he had loved and chosen to draw a clear, firm line and stand beside him. Instead, Madison tightened her crossed arms and offered Jamal a smug, self-satisfied smirk. "Dad is right, Jamal," she said, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who had never considered that her comfort might come at another person's expense. "Stop trying to drag the conversation down to your level. You are always so anxious about rules and compliance. It is honestly embarrassing to witness. Go get yourself a drink, mingle with the guests, and try to relax. You are actively ruining the holiday for everyone with your endless worrying." In that precise, freezing moment, the illusion shattered completely. The heavy, invisible chain of loyalty Jamal had carried quietly for years snapped apart with a clarity that was almost physical. He looked at his wife, truly, fully, without the filter of love or hope, and saw her for exactly who she was. Not a flawed but fundamentally good person making naive mistakes. A greedy, complicit, and fundamentally corrupt participant in her family's fraud, who would smile warmly while her father humiliated her husband, and who would not hesitate to let Jamal absorb the legal consequences if her financial recklessness ever caught up to her. He was nothing more than a credible legal shield she kept available for emergencies. The profound clarity of that betrayal moved through Jamal like ice water, leaving behind not heat or devastation, but a cold, precise, mechanical focus. He was a man of the law. He was currently standing in a house full of arrogant, entitled criminals who were absolutely convinced of their own permanent invincibility. "You are absolutely right," Jamal said, lowering his chin and adopting an expression of practiced, convincing submission. His voice was smooth and stripped of every trace of the revolution occurring behind his eyes. "I apologize, William. I overstepped significantly. It is not my place to question the internal financial operations of Apex Distribution. I will go and get a drink and spend some time with the guests. Please excuse me." William grunted with visible satisfaction, expanding his chest with the pleasure of a man who believed he had just reasserted complete dominance. Madison smiled broadly, clearly delighted to have won the confrontation without having to invest any real effort. They turned their backs on Jamal in unison and walked toward the dining room, dismissing his existence entirely before he had even left the hallway. Jamal walked away from them, blending seamlessly and invisibly back into the background of the lavish party. He did not go to the bar. He did not make small talk with Brad's wealthy, obtuse parents. Instead, he moved silently and deliberately through the crowded corridors, slipping unnoticed into the dark, empty library located just down the hall from William's private study. He closed the heavy doors softly behind him and locked them with a quiet turn of the handle. He stood for a moment in the pitch-dark room, surrounded by unread books and decorative antique globes, and pulled his encrypted smartphone from his jacket pocket. Jamal was not merely a brilliant attorney, he was also highly technically competent. 2 years ago, when William complained loudly about the sluggish internet speeds throughout the mansion, Jamal had personally upgraded and installed the commercial-grade routers for the entire estate network. He knew its exact architecture with precision. More importantly, he knew William's lazy, predictable administrative passwords, the kind chosen by a man who believed his wealth placed him beyond reach of any meaningful digital threat, and who had left his private home office desktop entirely unsecured on the shared household network. Jamal connected his phone to the mansion's primary Wi-Fi. His fingers moved across the digital keyboard with practiced, terrifying speed. He bypassed the basic firewall and accessed the shared network drive hosted on the desktop in the adjacent study. The screen of his phone illuminated his face in the dark library like a lantern. A list of internal directory folders populated rapidly on his screen. He scrolled with focused efficiency, bypassing personal photos and generic legal templates, searching for the core financial data at the heart of the operation. He found a heavily nested folder concealed beneath a vague, deliberately unassuming label. He opened it. Inside were hundreds of meticulously organized spreadsheets, PDF documents, wire transfer receipts, and offshore banking confirmations, labeled with dates stretching back nearly a full decade. This was the master ledger. This was the raw, unedited financial reality of Apex Distribution, completely free of the sanitized, curated lies William presented to external auditors and investors. Jamal initiated a massive, silent download directly to a secure, encrypted private cloud server and watched the loading bar appear on his screen, advancing steadily across the interface. The mansion's high-speed connection made the transfer extraordinarily fast, 10%, 30, 60. He watched the data flow. Every fake shell company, every embezzled pension fund withdrawal, every fraudulent corporate expense used to bankroll Madison's lifestyle, downloading cleanly and completely into his possession. He was capturing the precise coordinates of their total financial and legal destruction. 100%. Download complete. Jamal closed the connection, wiped his access history cleanly from the router logs, and locked his phone without hesitation. He slipped the device back into the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket, adjusted his cuffs, smoothed his tie, and unlocked the library doors with a steady hand. He stepped back out into the bright, noisy, utterly oblivious hallway and rejoined the Thanksgiving celebration without drawing a single glance. The deferential, disrespected son-in-law they had dismissed and humiliated an hour earlier was gone. The federal whistleblower had just stepped quietly into the game, holding in his encrypted pocket precisely the weapons needed to reduce their entire carefully constructed empire to ash. I remained completely still near the swinging kitchen doors, holding the empty silver catering tray against my hip. I watched Jamal walk back into the crowded dining room. His face remained a masterclass in absolute total composure. Not a single visible muscle betrayed the explosive, silent revolution he had just set irreversibly in motion. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket with one smooth gesture and dissolved seamlessly back into the wealthy crowd of entirely oblivious guests. I knew my parting words to William in the private study had lit a fuse that could not be extinguished. I was simply waiting, with steady and patient certainty, for the explosion that would tear through the mansion's glittering, fraudulent facade. It did not take long. The heavy oak doors of the West Wing flew open with a violent, resounding crash. The sharp sound tore through the sprawling estate, slicing cleanly through the refined aristocratic chatter and the soft classical music drifting from the hidden surround sound speakers. William came down the long corridor like a force of nature detonating. His face was a mask of pure, uncontained animal rage. He was not moving like a sophisticated, self-possessed host. He was storming like a wounded, cornered animal that had finally run out of room to maneuver. Catherine trailed frantically close behind him, her heavy velvet gown swishing against the hardwood floor as she struggled to keep pace with his pounding, furious strides. I gripped the rigid edges of the silver catering tray and refused to break eye contact as he approached. William bypassed the elite guests mingling in the parlor. He ignored Brad and his affluent parents sipping imported brandy beside the massive stone fireplace. He made a direct, aggressive beeline for the dining room archway where I stood. He no longer cared about social decorum. He no longer cared about maintaining appearances for his investors. The explicit, credible threat of an IRS audit had shattered his carefully assembled facade of aristocratic authority, and raw panic had overridden every instinct for self-preservation. "Everyone look at this ungrateful wretch," William bellowed, his deep voice filling and then overwhelming the grand living room. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. The holiday party came to a sudden collective halt. The classical music seemed to fade entirely into nothing. Dozens of high society guests turned their heads in unison, crystal glasses suspended mid-air. Madison gasped loudly, clutching Brad's arm, her eyes darting rapidly between me and her furious father. Jamal stood near the edge of the crowd, his face a completely unreadable mask of patient, calm calculation. William stepped so close to me that I could smell the sharp, bitter edge of expensive scotch on his breath. "We opened our home to her," he shouted, ensuring every single guest in the building could absorb his fabricated victimhood. "We fed her. We welcomed her at our holiday table despite everything she has deliberately done to destroy this family. And how does she repay our generosity? She attempts to extort us. She demands money and threatens to destroy our business if we do not comply." Shocked, uncomfortable whispers erupted immediately across the room. Brad's mother placed a delicate, alarmed hand over her pearl necklace and looked at me with an expression of profound, unfiltered revulsion. The guests were consuming the lies precisely as William had designed them to, cleanly, quickly, and without question. "Extortion," Catherine echoed, stepping up beside my father and adopting the expression of a woman suffering through agonizing, undeserved heartbreak. She wiped an entirely imaginary tear from the corner of her eye with a trembling hand. "We offered her a genuine lifeline today. We offered to help her rebuild her life after she destroyed her own career through criminal behavior. And she responded by demanding a massive cash payout. She threatened to fabricate vicious lies about this family and take them to the authorities if we refused to give her money." I looked at my parents without blinking. The sheer, almost majestic magnitude of their delusion was something to witness. They were desperately, publicly attempting to flip the narrative in real time, painting me as a deranged, desperate extortionist in order to preemptively discredit anything I might credibly say about their financial crimes. If they convinced this room full of wealthy, influential people that I was a dangerous liar, no one would believe a word I said when the truth about the blind trust and the commercial land lease finally became undeniable. They were mounting an offense as a form of defense. I recognized the strategy the moment it began. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I stood perfectly straight and let the silence stretch for a long, deliberate, uncomfortable moment, forcing everyone in the room to wait for my response. "I did not ask you for a single dollar, Dad," I said, projecting my voice with calm, unhurried clarity across the dead silent room. "You are the one who dragged me into your locked private study. You are the one who demanded I sign over the deed to my downtown condominium so you could use it as collateral for a high-interest emergency bridge loan you cannot otherwise secure." The whispers in the room shifted in tone immediately and unmistakably. The wealthy guests exchanged confused, uneasy glances with one another. A billionaire CEO begging his unemployed, blacklisted daughter for a modest one-bedroom condo. It made absolutely no logical sense to anyone in that room with even a basic grasp of corporate finance, and they all knew it. William's face turned a violent, mottled shade of purple. "Shut your mouth," he roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You are a pathological liar. You are a convicted thief. Not a single person in this room believes a word coming out of your mouth. You are a jealous failure trying to drag down everything this family has built through decades of hard work." I took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the remaining physical distance between us entirely. I set the catering tray down on the nearest mahogany side table. The heavy silver hit the solid wood with a sharp crack that made several nearby guests flinch. I looked directly and specifically at Brad's father, the commercial real estate investor, making certain my words landed precisely where they would cause the most immediate impact. "I am not lying," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register that carried throughout the suddenly silent room. "There is no brief business expansion. Apex Distribution is completely out of cash. The company is hemorrhaging money from every operational point. They are using corporate credit lines to purchase luxury sports cars for a chief financial officer who cannot file a basic quarterly tax return. They are 90 days delinquent on their commercial lease. They are drowning in insurmountable fraudulent debt. Their entire empire, every bit of it, is built on fabricated balance sheets and stolen employee pension funds." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of deep, ringing silence that only descends in the final moments before a catastrophic impact. Brad's father, a man who had invested substantially in local commercial real estate and who understood precisely what those words meant, narrowed his eyes and studied William's face with sudden, sharp, unforgiving suspicion. The atmosphere in the room transformed entirely, shifting from dramatic entertainment to acute financial alarm in the space of a breath. William saw it happen. He saw the distinct look of doubt forming on his most important investor's face. He watched his carefully cultivated reputation actively disintegrate in front of the people who mattered most to him. He saw the absolute, unassailable truth shining steadily in my eyes, and he finally understood, in the marrow of his bones, that he could not lie his way out of this room. The walls were closing from every direction simultaneously. He lost total control. William raised his large right hand and swung it with every ounce of his furious, desperate strength. The slap echoed through the grand living room like a gunshot. The sheer physical force of the impact snapped my head violently to one side. The pain was immediate and blindingly hot, radiating outward from my left cheekbone, ringing sharply in my ear. I stumbled backward, my shoulders striking the painted wall hard enough to keep myself from dropping entirely to the polished floor. Gasps of genuine, unfeigned horror moved through the crowd in a wave. Someone dropped a crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the hardwood, sending glittering shards skittering across the Persian rug. Madison shrieked and covered her mouth with both manicured hands. Brad took a visible, immediate step backward, putting deliberate physical distance between himself and my father. Even among people who had spent their lives insulated from consequence, there were uncrossable lines. William had just crossed every one of them simultaneously, in front of the very audience he needed most to impress. I stood frozen against the wall. The metallic taste of blood gathered slowly in the corner of my mouth, where my teeth had cut deeply into my inner lip. The left side of my face throbbed with a deep, burning, radiating heat. I did not raise my hand to touch the injury. I did not look away from the room. I simply breathed, staring at the floor as the shock of the assault reverberated through my body in slow, radiating waves. Catherine broke the stunned and terrifying silence first. She did not rush forward to comfort me. She did not admonish her husband for striking his own daughter across the face in front of a room full of witnesses. Instead, she weaponized the chaos with practiced, predatory efficiency, using the disruption to finish what they had started. "Get out!" Catherine screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, shrill pitch that cut through the stunned silence of the room. "Get out of my house right now. You are a toxic infection. You come into our home and spread your disgusting lies and poison our beautiful holiday. You are no longer a part of this family. I never want to see your miserable face again. Get out and never dare to return." I slowly turned my head back to look at them. I did not cry. My eyes were completely dry. I raised my hand and gently touched my burning cheek. My fingertips came away with a small, bright smear of crimson blood from the corner of my split lip. I looked at the blood on my fingers for a long, quiet moment. Then I looked directly at William. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his fist still clenched tightly at his side. He looked absolutely terrified, not of me, but of what he had just done in front of witnesses he could not control or silence. He had let his rage completely override his logic, and somewhere behind his furious eyes, he understood that he could never take that violent public action back. He had crossed the point of no return, and he knew it. I lowered my hand. A slow, cold, predatory smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of submission, pain, or defeat. It was the precise, controlled smile of a woman who had just watched her enemies walk deliberately into a steel trap and lock the heavy door behind themselves with their own hands. They wanted to play the victims. They wanted to exile me from their kingdom with maximum drama and maximum audience. They had absolutely no idea that I already owned the very ground they were standing on. "You do not have to ask me twice, Mother," I said, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of emotion. "I am leaving. Enjoy your Thanksgiving, because it will absolutely be the last one you ever host in this city." I did not look at the shocked, murmuring guests. I did not look at Madison. I did not look at Jamal, who stood perfectly still near the edge of the room, his dark eyes tracking my every movement with silent, focused solidarity. I simply turned my back on all of them. I walked down the grand hallway with slow, measured steps, my footsteps echoing against the polished hardwood with deliberate calm. I grabbed my thin wool coat from the chair where Catherine had carelessly discarded it earlier in the evening. I pulled the heavy front door open, letting the freezing Chicago winter air rush in from outside, cutting through the overheated, toxic atmosphere of the mansion like a blade. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut firmly behind me, cutting off the sound of their panicking, fractured murmurs. The night air was brutally cold. The wind whipped across the expansive, manicured lawn, biting through my thin coat and stinging the already burning skin of my left cheek. I walked down the long cobblestone driveway, my heels crunching against the thin layer of frost accumulating steadily on the ground. I walked past Madison's brand-new Porsche Panamera, gleaming under the floodlights. I walked past the row of luxury vehicles belonging to the guests who had just watched my father assault me without a word of intervention. I reached my rusted 10-year-old sedan parked in the dark shadows near the main gate. My hands were trembling slightly as I pulled my keys from my coat pocket. It was not from fear or grief. It was pure, clarifying, unadulterated adrenaline. The plan was officially in motion. The war had truly begun. I unlocked the car door and slid into the freezing driver's seat. I shoved the key into the ignition and twisted it. The old engine sputtered, coughed twice, and finally roared to life, the heater blowing cold air directly into my face. I reached for the gear shift, ready to put the car in drive and leave this toxic compound behind forever. Then the passenger side door handle clicked. The heavy metal door swung open, pulling a sharp gust of freezing wind into the dark cabin. I flinched, turning sharply, expecting to see William coming out to finish what he started, or Catherine emerging to hurl more threats into the night. It was neither of my parents. Jamal slid into the passenger seat and pulled the door shut firmly behind him. He was still wearing his tailored charcoal suit, but he had removed his tie. The dim dome light of the car illuminated his face. His expression was completely focused, his dark eyes sharp and calculating, already several moves ahead. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not offer empty apologies for my family's behavior. He knew we were far past the point of polite comfort or sympathetic words. Jamal reached into his suit jacket pocket and produced a small, sleek silver flash drive. The metal caught the faint light of the car cabin and gleamed brightly between his fingers. He held it out, extending his hand across the center console toward me. "You were right about the books," Jamal said, his deep, resonant voice filling the quiet space of my battered car with calm, absolute certainty. "You were right about all of it. The shell companies, the fake vendor payouts, the embezzled pension funds. I bypassed William's home network security and downloaded the entire raw, unfiltered financial ledger of Apex Distribution. It is all right here. Every single fraudulent transaction they have made over the last decade." I stared at the silver flash drive resting in his open palm. The ultimate weapon. The final piece of the puzzle I needed to completely and permanently dismantle my parents' corporate empire and hand them directly to the federal authorities. I slowly reached out and closed my fingers tightly around the cold metal. "Put the car in drive, Rachel," Jamal said, leaning back against the worn fabric of the passenger seat with the quiet composure of a man who had already decided exactly what came next. "Let us go find a coffee. We have a great deal of accounting to do." I shifted the car into drive and pressed my foot down hard on the accelerator. The tires spun briefly on the icy cobblestones before catching traction with a sharp lurch. We sped out through the massive wrought iron gates and left the glowing, toxic mansion receding in the rearview mirror. The drive into the city was entirely silent. The adrenaline from the confrontation bled slowly out of my system, leaving behind a cold, throbbing ache across my left cheek where my father's hand had landed. We found a 24-hour diner nestled beneath the rusty steel tracks of the elevated train line, a gritty, neon-lit sanctuary, empty except for a tired waitress methodically wiping down a Formica counter. The air smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaning fluid. It was the exact, complete opposite of the catered luxury we had just fled, and it felt infinitely safer for it. We slid into a cracked red vinyl booth in the far back corner. Jamal ordered a black coffee. I ordered the same. I placed my laptop on the sticky table and opened the lid. Jamal looked at the harsh fluorescent light reflecting off the bruising already forming along my cheekbone. "I should have stepped in," he said, his voice carrying a quiet, tightly controlled anger that was more unsettling than anything louder would have been. "I should have broken his jaw the second he raised his hand to you." "No," I said firmly, without looking up from the screen. "If you had touched him, they would have called the police. You would have been arrested for assaulting a billionaire in his own home. You did exactly what you needed to do. You stayed composed, and you secured the data. That is worth far more than anything else you could have done in that room." Jamal took a slow sip of his coffee. "I spent 5 years absorbing the microaggressions, Rachel. I sat at that mahogany table and let William methodically belittle my background, my education, my neighborhood. I let Catherine make her carefully worded, deniable comments about my upbringing on the South Side. I swallowed it all because I loved Madison. I genuinely believed she was fundamentally different from them, that she was simply caught in their orbit, not driving it. "The golden child is never trapped," I said, my voice flat and certain. "They are the designated heir to the corruption." Jamal nodded slowly, his dark eyes hardening into something resolute and final. "Tonight, William told me to remember my place in his house. He called me a low-level paper pusher and reminded me that I was only at his table because he allowed it." And Madison smiled. She defended him. She looked at me like I was an inconvenient liability she had not yet found a use for. That was my absolute breaking point. "Welcome to the outside," I said, typing in my laptop password. 2 years ago, I was the lead internal auditor running a standard variance analysis on the operational budget. I found a massive, inexplicable discrepancy in the employee pension fund. William and Catherine were aggressively skimming the retirement accounts of their oldest, most loyal warehouse workers, people who had given decades of their working lives to that company, and funneling the cash directly to finance Madison's custom jewelry and her month-long European vacations. I paused, feeling the familiar, specific burn of that betrayal move through my chest. When I brought the spreadsheets to them, I expected alarm. I expected at minimum an acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. Instead, they looked at me with pure, undisguised disgust. They locked me out of the building that same night. They wiped my hard drive remotely and fabricated a wire transfer using my administrative credentials to move $250,000 into a dummy account. They framed me for embezzlement, threatened to hand fabricated evidence to the police if I went to the authorities, and then systematically destroyed my career to ensure I never had the platform or the resources to fight back. They sacrificed my entire professional life to protect Madison's shopping habits. Jamal reached into his suit jacket and set the silver flash drive carefully on the table beside my laptop. They made a catastrophic, irreversible miscalculation, he said, his voice taking on the quiet, precise quality of a man building an airtight case. They framed a top-tier supply chain auditor and I know the federal tax code. I know exactly how the IRS tracks offshore asset sheltering, phantom vendor schemes, and deliberate corporate embezzlement. Together, we can dismantle this entire empire down to its foundation. Then let us get to work, I said. I plugged the silver flash drive into the USB port. A notification populated on the screen immediately. The drive was loaded with hundreds of gigabytes of raw, unencrypted data. Jamal had completely bypassed William's lazy security protocols and copied the master directory of the home office network in its entirety. I opened the primary financial ledger for the current fiscal year and let my eyes move across the columns of figures. As a trained auditor, I did not need a calculator to identify the catastrophic anomalies buried in the numbers. The data told a deeply disturbing story. "Look at this," I said, pointing at the screen. "These are the vendor payout logs. Apex Distribution is routing millions of dollars to a logistics firm called Horizon Logistics. But I know for a fact that Apex uses an entirely different fleet for their Midwest distribution corridor. I audited those contracts personally. Horizon Logistics does not exist. It is a phantom vendor, a constructed entity designed to drain operational funds directly into a controlled account." Jamal leaned forward, his eyes rapidly tracking the routing numbers attached to the phantom payouts. "Copy that routing number and cross-reference it with the banking directory," he instructed. I ran the search. The results came back in seconds. The routing number did not belong to any domestic commercial bank. It belonged to an offshore financial institution registered in the Cayman Islands. "They are not simply skimming the pension funds," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a low, stunned register. "This is a massive, coordinated tax evasion syndicate. William and Catherine are deliberately defaulting on their domestic commercial lease. They are deliberately missing legitimate vendor payments and reporting catastrophic operational losses to the IRS to minimize their corporate tax exposure. But in reality, they are draining every dollar of liquid cash out of Apex Distribution and routing it into untraceable offshore accounts, while the domestic business collapses around them." I clicked through another nested folder and pulled up the tax returns from the previous 3 fiscal years. "They have siphoned at least $12 million into the Cayman accounts," I said, my pulse accelerating as the full, staggering scale of the felony unfolded across the screen. "They are deliberately bankrupting the company on paper while building an untouchable offshore fortune. They intend to let Apex Distribution collapse entirely under the weight of its fabricated debt, leaving the employees with nothing, not even the pension funds they spent careers contributing to. And Madison is the chief financial officer of record," Jamal said, his jaw set tight. "Her signature appears on every single one of these fraudulent federal tax returns. She is personally authorizing the transfer of stolen funds to the Cayman Islands, while simultaneously using those same maxed-out corporate credit lines to purchase a $120,000 sports car she is charging as an operational business expense." We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the full magnitude of what we were looking at. William and Catherine were not simply greedy and reckless business owners who had let things spiral out of control. They were sophisticated, methodical criminals running a highly structured offshore sheltering operation, one that had been deliberately constructed over nearly a decade. They had destroyed my professional life and my reputation to protect a $12 million federal tax fraud conspiracy. I continued scrolling through the master directory, moving past the offshore banking records and the fabricated operational invoices. Near the very bottom of the directory tree, I noticed a strangely labeled subfolder hidden inside a redundant file path that was clearly designed to be overlooked by anyone scanning quickly. "What is this?" I asked, highlighting the folder. It was labeled Liability Mitigation. "Open it," Jamal said immediately, his tone shifting from analytical precision to something sharper and more urgent. In corporate law, liability mitigation typically refers to insurance instruments or formal legal defense architecture. But William does not use standard legal terminology unless he is actively concealing something highly sensitive beneath it. I double-clicked the folder. Inside were several high-resolution scanned PDF documents. I opened the first file. It was a formal legal contract bearing the official letterhead of Apex Distribution. As I read through the densely worded text, my blood ran cold. "Jamal," I whispered, my voice carrying the particular tremor of someone confronting something genuinely terrifying. "Look at this." Jamal leaned forward and his eyes moved rapidly across the dense legal language. The document was a binding fiduciary appointment contract, a formal legal instrument explicitly naming a designated individual as the primary legal consultant responsible for all offshore tax strategy and corporate fund routing for Apex Distribution. It had been carefully constructed as a legally binding document designed to transfer 100% of the criminal liability for the Cayman Island accounts onto a single external party. I scrolled to the signature line at the very bottom of the final page. There was a signature written in clean blue ink. Beside the signature was a date stamp from 6 months prior. Jamal stared at the screen. The color drained from his face completely, leaving him looking physically ill. He reached out and touched the laptop screen, his finger tracing the signature with a slow, careful movement. "That is my signature," Jamal said, his voice cracking with the full weight of horrified realization. "Did you sign this, Jamal?" "No," he said, breathing in short, controlled bursts, his dark eyes wide and fixed. "I have never seen this document in my life. I have deliberately kept my legal practice completely and entirely separate from their business operations. I made that decision from the beginning." I opened the next PDF file in the folder. It was an internal email chain between William and Madison, dated just a few days before the forged contract was supposedly executed. "Madison sent William a copy of your signature lifted from the joint tax return you filed together last year," I said, reading the body of the email carefully aloud. She told him it would be straightforward to digitally isolate the signature and apply it to the fiduciary contracts with a clean result. Jamal fell back against the red vinyl booth. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal hit him with the force of something physical, a blow that could not be absorbed by composure or legal training or years of practiced stoicism. He stared blankly at the water-stained ceiling of the diner, processing the full, catastrophic reality of what he was looking at with slow, deliberate breaths. William and Catherine were not simply evading taxes or hoarding millions in offshore accounts. They had known from the beginning that a company hemorrhaging this much operational cash would eventually trigger a federal audit. They had known they needed a credible, legally sophisticated escape route when the investigators finally arrived. They were not planning to take the fall themselves. They had been engineering a fall guy from the very start, and they had chosen the one person in their orbit whose professional credibility would make the fraud look like a sophisticated, externally managed scheme. "They forged your signature," I said, closing the laptop screen slightly to protect the documents from any passing glance. They designated you as the architect and primary operator of the entire offshore tax evasion syndicate. If the IRS audits Apex Distribution, William and Catherine walk away completely clean. Madison walks away clean. And you walk directly into a federal indictment for a $12 million conspiracy you had no knowledge of and no part in constructing. Jamal looked at me. His eyes had taken on a burning, focused intensity that replaced the shock almost entirely. "They are planning to send me to federal prison," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not from weakness, but from the sheer, precise weight of the words. My own wife forged my signature to frame me for a $12 million federal crime. My own wife looked at me across the dinner table every single night, knowing she had quietly signed my life away. She watched me swallow her father's racism and her mother's contempt to keep the peace in that house. And the entire time, she was constructing the mechanism that would hand me to federal prosecutors. He reached up with trembling fingers and carefully removed his wire-framed glasses. He set them on the sticky vinyl table with meticulous, deliberate precision, the gesture of a man forcing himself to remain in control of something that desperately wanted to break. He did not cry. He did not raise his voice. He stared at the glowing screen with a look of absolute, terrifying, focused rage. His large hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and cast long, harsh shadows across his face. For a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the precise, uncompromising adherence of federal law, who had sacrificed comfort, ease, and a great deal of pride to operate with complete integrity within systems that were never designed with him in mind, the betrayal was absolute and total. Madison had not simply lied to him or cheated him financially. She had actively and deliberately planned to strip him of his freedom. She had signed off on a scheme to send her own husband to a federal penitentiary so she could continue driving a luxury car and booking month-long European vacations on stolen money. Do you know what the mandatory minimum sentence is for a $12 million offshore tax evasion conspiracy? Jamal asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly near whisper. I shook my head and stayed quiet, giving him the space to speak. 20 years in a federal penitentiary, he stated, his dark eyes finding mine across the table. 20 years. And they compounded that with aggravated corporate fraud and identity theft by forging my signature on fiduciary documents. William and Catherine knew precisely what they were constructing. They knew the IRS would eventually audit a company bleeding this much cash. They needed a scapegoat with a verified legal background who could lend credibility and apparent sophistication to their offshore routing architecture. They chose me specifically because I am a licensed tax attorney. My professional credentials would make the fraud appear to be the work of a knowledgeable external consultant rather than a desperate family looting their own company. They used your professional reputation to build their safety net, I said, the full depth of their calculated depravity settling over me. They brought you into this family specifically to manufacture a human shield, and Madison built it with them, piece by piece, smile by smile. My wife sent them my signature, Jamal said, his voice vibrating with a raw, barely contained fury that had nowhere yet to go. She smiled at me across that dinner table every single night, knowing exactly what she had set in motion. She watched me absorb her father's contempt and swallow my own dignity to preserve her family's peace. And the entire time, she was preparing to hand me to the federal prosecutors as the named architect of their crimes. He picked up his coffee cup. His hand was shaking so significantly that dark liquid sloshed over the rim and spread across the table. He set the mug down hard. I am not going to prison for them. Jamal's tone shifted in that moment, cleanly and completely, from devastation to absolute operational resolve. I am a black man in America, Rachel. If I walk into a federal courtroom facing $12 million in corporate fraud charges with a forged signature on the fiduciary documents, I will not receive the benefit of the doubt that William Pierce is counting on for himself. They will bury me. William knows that. He is counting on it. He is counting on the federal justice system to look at a wealthy, well-connected billionaire patriarch and a working-class black attorney from the South Side and assign the guilt along the most convenient lines available. He is profoundly underestimating you, I said, holding his gaze across the table. He is underestimating both of us. We are not victims here, Jamal. We have the master directory. We have the complete, raw, unencrypted financial data. We have the offshore routing numbers. We have the internal emails proving that Madison personally supplied your forged signature with full knowledge of how it would be used. We hold every single piece of evidence required to put every one of them away permanently. Jamal put his glasses back on. The sharp, precise analytical focus returned to his eyes with an almost audible snap. He was no longer a betrayed husband sitting in a diner booth at midnight. He was a ruthless, highly trained federal tax attorney preparing for the most consequential case of his career. You are absolutely right, he said, pulling his encrypted smartphone from his jacket pocket with steady hands. We are not going to sit and wait for the IRS to eventually audit them. We are going to hand-deliver the execution order ourselves. Have you ever heard of the IRS Whistleblower Reward Program? I nodded, my professional background surfacing instinctively. Form 211. It allows individuals who report substantial tax evasion to receive a percentage of the total recovered funds, and it grants them specific legal protections for providing the corroborating evidence. Exactly, Jamal said, his fingers moving across his phone screen with practiced, deliberate speed. But I am not going to use the standard public submission portal. I am a specialized tax attorney with direct, established contacts within the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. When reported fraud exceeds $2 million, the IRS fast-tracks the investigation. We are presenting a $12 million offshore syndicate with documented routing numbers, forged internal fiduciary documents, and authenticated email evidence of conspiracy. This is a Tier 1 federal felony case. He looked at me steadily. I am drafting a formal whistleblower submission right now. I will attach the offshore routing numbers, the fabricated operational invoices, and the internal email chain proving the forgery of my signature. I will simultaneously request immediate federal immunity for myself in exchange for serving as their primary inside witness and evidence provider. Because I am a licensed officer of the court reporting an active, documented felony conspiracy, the immunity will be granted without delay in order to secure the data and my cooperation. How quickly will they move? I asked, feeling the adrenaline returning in a clean, focused surge. With this level of verified, encrypted primary source evidence, Jamal said with complete, unhesitating certainty, they will not send courtesy letters. The Criminal Investigation Division does not issue polite warnings for offshore tax evasion of this magnitude. They send armed federal agents. They will freeze every bank account associated with Apex distribution. They will freeze William and Catherine's personal accounts. They will seize the mansion and the vehicles. They will strip every dollar they have ever stolen before the sun goes down on the day the warrant is executed. We worked in the diner booth for the next 2 hours in complete synchronized silence, a devastatingly effective team built from the wreckage of 2 separate betrayals. I navigated the complex supply chain financial directories, extracting the precise dates, times, and authorization signatures behind each phantom vendor payout. Jamal drafted a flawless, airtight legal brief detailing the exact federal statutes violated by every transaction, cross-referencing the offshore routing data with IRS classification codes. Together, We assembled a digital dossier so comprehensive and legally unimpeachable that no defense attorney in the country would find a viable angle of attack against it. Jamal attached the encrypted evidence package to a highly secure federal server portal and reviewed the final submission one final time, his finger hovering just above the screen. "This will destroy her life," he said quietly, looking at the digital file containing Madison's internal emails, the ones where she had discussed lifting his signature with casual, cheerful efficiency. "She made that choice the moment she stole your signature," I said, without softness or hesitation. "She chose a luxury sports car over her husband's freedom. She made that calculation deliberately, and she made it in writing." Jamal did not hesitate another moment. He pressed his finger against the screen and submitted the complete evidence package directly to the federal authorities. The confirmation message flashed in the dim diner light. The strike was launched. The federal government now held the keys to the Apex distribution empire, and to the offshore accounts William and Catherine believed were safely beyond anyone's reach. "We did it," I breathed, leaning back against the vinyl booth and feeling a massive physical weight lift from my chest for the first time in 2 years. "They are finished." The words had barely left my mouth when my cell phone buzzed sharply against the table. The sudden vibration startled us both. I picked it up. It was an urgent email notification, and when I looked at the sender, my heart skipped a full beat. It was an encrypted message from Jonathan Pierce. I opened it immediately, my eyes moving quickly across the brief, heavily coded text. Jonathan did not waste words. "Rachel," he had written, "situation has escalated. William is panicking. He has located a buyer for the commercial land. The developers are bypassing standard due diligence to secure the zoning rights before year end. William is attempting to push through a fraudulent title transfer tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp. He wants to secure the $15 million cash payout before the banks realize he is insolvent. They are meeting in the main boardroom at Apex Distribution headquarters. Be ready." I stared at the screen. William knew his shell companies were collapsing under their own weight. He could feel the money running out in real time. He was attempting to execute a desperate, illegal real estate transaction to generate $15 million in liquid cash before the consequences closed around him from every direction. He was planning to forge the property deed and sell land that rightfully and legally belonged to my blind trust, land he had been paying me rent on for a decade without knowing it. He intended to use the cash to disappear. "What is it?" Jamal asked, reading the shift in my expression immediately. "William is attempting to sell the commercial land tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I said, turning the phone so he could read Jonathan's message directly. "He is bringing the developers into the Apex boardroom to execute a fraudulent deed transfer. He wants $15 million in cash, and he wants it done before anyone can stop him." Jamal absorbed the message in seconds, his legal mind processing the timeline with rapid, surgical clarity. If he executes a fraudulent deed transfer for $15 million, that elevates his criminal exposure from tax evasion to large-scale commercial real estate fraud and grand larceny. It is the final, definitive nail. I closed my laptop and slid it into my bag. The deep exhaustion of the long night evaporated in an instant, replaced by a burning, brilliant, absolute clarity. My parents had spent 2 years telling every employer in Chicago that I was a criminal. They had locked me out of my career, blacklisted me across an entire industry, slapped me across the face in front of a room full of witnesses, and thrown me into the freezing winter night believing they had won. They thought they were completely, permanently untouchable. "We need to contact your federal sources at the IRS right now," I said, looking at Jamal directly and without hesitation. "Tell the agents to meet us at the Apex Distribution headquarters tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Jamal pulled on his coat and slid out of the diner booth in one smooth motion. A cold, precise, predatory smile crossed his face for the first time all night. I will tell them to bring the handcuffs, he said. I left a $20 bill on the table for the tired waitress who had refilled our coffees without a word all evening, and walked out of the diner into the freezing Chicago morning. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city skyline, casting a pale, brilliant gold across the rooftops and the elevated rail tracks, and the still, frost-covered streets below. Tomorrow morning, William and Catherine were going to sit in their luxurious boardroom and attempt to steal $15 million from a blind trust they did not know I controlled. They were going to smile at wealthy developers and extend their hands and believe, with complete, unshakable arrogance, that they had survived the worst and come out ahead. And I was going to walk through those boardroom doors and take absolutely everything from them. The digital clock mounted on the wall of the Apex Distribution boardroom flashed 9:45 in sharp red numerals. The room was designed to project absolute, unassailable corporate dominance. The conference table was cut from a single slab of imported marble. The leather executive chairs cost more per unit than the average warehouse worker earned in 6 months of full-time labor. But on this particular morning, the luxury felt less like power and more like a suffocating trap, a stage set for a performance that was already coming apart at the seams. William stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring down at the loading docks below with the hollow, mechanical focus of a man trying to hold himself together through sheer force of will. He pulled at the collar of his custom-tailored suit, feeling a cold drop of sweat slide slowly down the length of his spine. The warehouse below was terrifyingly silent. The entire fleet of delivery trucks sat cold and motionless in the parking lot. The engines were off. The drivers had not reported for their morning shifts, and they would not, because the payroll checks issued 48 hours ago had bounced without clearing. Apex Distribution was completely and entirely out of operating cash. William turned from the window and began pacing the length of the marble floor, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. His chest was tight with a suffocating, escalating panic he was working desperately to conceal beneath the surface of executive composure. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands held $12 million, but that money was locked behind layers of illegal shell company structures that he could not access without triggering the very federal audit he was trying to outrun. His domestic accounts were overdrawn, the corporate credit lines were entirely exhausted, depleted by Madison's Porsche, by Catherine's holiday catering, by a decade of draining a company from the inside while projecting the image of a thriving empire. If they did not secure $15 million in liquid, untraceable cash before the end of this morning, the entire structure would collapse by nightfall. The creditors would move on the building, the employees would have nowhere to turn for their missing wages, and the federal authorities would begin looking very closely at the empty pension accounts that were supposed to protect people who had spent their careers trusting William's assurances. Catherine sat at the near end of the marble table, her fingers working anxiously at her diamond wedding ring, turning it in tight, repetitive circles. She looked profoundly exhausted. The polished, high society facade she had deployed with such practiced authority at the Thanksgiving dinner had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a frightened woman in an expensive dress. "Are you absolutely certain they are coming, William?" she asked, her voice thin and stretched with anxiety. What if the developers had second thoughts? What if someone looked too closely at the zoning permit documentation? "They are coming," William snapped, dragging a hand over his immaculately maintained silver hair. "They want this land, Catherine. They have already acquired the 3 adjacent parcels on the corridor. This headquarters is the final piece they need to complete the tech campus footprint. They are desperate to break ground before the winter freeze deepens. They will not be asking inconvenient questions this morning." Madison slouched in one of the executive chairs at the far end of the table, scrolling through her phone with an air of profound, almost theatrical boredom, the posture of someone who considered the impending collapse of a company built on stolen money to be a minor administrative inconvenience. She wore a tailored designer blazer and sipped a green smoothie, appearing entirely detached from the catastrophic stakes of what they were attempting to execute. "Relax, Mom," Madison sighed, setting her phone face down on the marble table with a deliberate, dismissive clatter. "You are visibly sweating through your silk blouse. This is a basic real estate transaction. We sign the documents. We accept the $15 million check. We wire the funds directly to the offshore accounts to stabilize the position. It is structurally straightforward." William stopped pacing and turned to look at his youngest daughter with an expression that combined dependence and barely concealed contempt. "It is not a basic real estate transaction, Madison. We are executing a sale of commercial land that legally belongs to a blind trust managed under the Pierce Global corporate umbrella. We are forging a property deed and presenting fabricated notarized release documents to a buyer with his own legal team in the room. If Jonathan Pierce's legal division flags the title transfer before the check clears and the funds move, none of us walk out of this building." Madison rolled her eyes with the practiced ease of someone who had never genuinely experienced consequences. She picked up a glossy silver pen and twirled it between her fingers. "You give Pierce Global far too much credit, Dad. Jonathan Pierce is managing a $100 billion international logistics corporation. He is not personally monitoring a 30-acre lot in a suburban industrial park. This blind trust is a minor bureaucratic instrument buried in a mountain of legacy corporate paperwork. He almost certainly does not even remember it exists." She leaned forward and tapped the fraudulent contract sitting in the center of the marble table with the silver pen. "Do you know how straightforward it was to bypass their legal process? I filed a quitclaim deed directly with the county clerk, asserting that Apex Distribution absorbed the trust assets during our last corporate restructuring. I ordered a replica of the Pierce Global corporate notary stamp for $40 from an online supplier. I applied it to the release forms myself. The county clerk processed it without a second glance. The documents are airtight." Catherine released a long, unsteady breath and pressed a hand flat against her chest. "You are extraordinary, Madison. Truly. I do not know what we would have done without your mind through all of this. It is fortunate we removed Rachel when we did. She would have buried this entire arrangement under her paranoid obsession with legal compliance." "Rachel is a weak, cowardly failure," William said, a sudden surge of aggressive bravado moving through him at the mention of my name. "She proved it decisively last night. She walked into our home, attempted a handful of empty threats, and the moment I put her in her place, she turned and ran out into the night. She does not have the stomach for real corporate warfare. We are the ones who build empires. We take what we want, and we protect what we have." The heavy digital clock clicked to 9:55. A sharp knock on the boardroom doors made all three of them flinch simultaneously. William straightened his tie rapidly, cleared his throat, and forced his features back into a mask of confident, controlled authority. Catherine sat upright and reassembled her high society smile with practiced speed. Madison closed out of her social media applications and opened a random financial spreadsheet on her laptop to simulate productivity. "Enter," William commanded, his voice projecting with the hollow boom of a man performing power he no longer genuinely possessed. The receptionist pulled the doors open and stepped aside. A team of 5 men walked into the boardroom in a tight, purposeful formation. Leading them was Mr. Thorne, a ruthless, highly successful commercial real estate developer who wore a sharp navy suit and carried himself with the aggressive, forward-leaning energy of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, before anyone else in the room understood what was happening. Behind him walked his lead legal counsel and 3 junior associates, each carrying heavy leather briefcases that landed on the marble table with decisive, authoritative weight. "William," Thorne announced, striding across the room and extending his hand with the brisk efficiency of a man who billed his time in 15-minute increments. "Let us get this finalized. I have a demolition crew on standby ready to begin site preparation the moment the ink dries on the transfer documents. William grasped his hand and shook it with manufactured firmness. We are fully prepared, Thorne. As we discussed, the closing needs to move today. We are finalizing the acquisition of our new facility across town by the end of the week, and we need this transaction to close clean and fast. Thorne nodded, taking the seat directly across the marble table. His attorneys opened their briefcases in synchronized motion, producing thick stacks of legal contracts and property transfer agreements with practiced efficiency. I have the cashier's check for $15 million, Thorne said, reaching into his breast pocket and placing a crisp bank envelope flat on the center of the marble table. Fully authenticated and ready for deposit into the Apex Distribution corporate account the moment my legal team clears the title documentation. I need to review the final quitclaim deed and the release forms from the Pierce Global Blind Trust. My counsel needs to confirm the title is completely clear of corporate liens before the funds change hands. William felt a cold bead of sweat form precisely at his left temple. He held his smile in place through concentrated effort. Of course, he said, gesturing toward Madison, my chief financial officer has all documentation prepared and fully verified. Madison smiled with absolute, unshakable confidence and slid the fraudulent folder across the marble table to Thorne's lead attorney. Everything is in perfect order, gentlemen, she stated, the silver pen resting loosely in her fingers. The Blind Trust was formally dissolved during our last quarter corporate restructuring. The Pierce Global corporate stamps on page 4 verify the immediate and complete release of all property rights directly to Apex Distribution. The transfer is clean and unencumbered. The lead attorney adjusted his glasses and lifted the folder from the table. The boardroom went completely silent. The only audible sounds were the soft ticking of the digital clock and the deliberate, unhurried rustle of heavy paper as the lawyer turned through the forged documents page by page. William felt his heartbeat slamming against his ribs with increasing, uncontrollable force. He watched the attorney's eyes move across the fabricated corporate stamps. He watched him read through the fraudulent signature Madison had applied with such confident, amateur precision. If this man noticed the inconsistency in the notary seal font, if he detected the slight misalignment of the stamp impression, if he reached for his phone to verify the transaction directly with the Pierce Global Legal Division, the entire construction would collapse in seconds, and there would be nowhere left to run. Catherine gripped the edge of her chair with both hands, her knuckles white, her breathing carefully controlled. Madison simply sipped her smoothie, radiantly unconcerned, utterly convinced that her $40 stamp and her borrowed signature had built something impenetrable. The attorney reached page 4. He stared at the fabricated Pierce Global notary stamp for a long, excruciating moment. He ran his thumb slowly across the surface of the ink. William felt the blood rushing in his ears like a tide of white noise. His entire life, his freedom, his mansion, his offshore accounts, every single thing he had spent decades building and stealing hung entirely in the balance of this single terrifying second. The lawyer looked up slowly from the document and turned his measured gaze to Thorne. The title is clear, the lawyer stated, closing the folder with a precise, deliberate snap and sliding it back to the center of the table. The release forms are properly stamped and notarized by the parent trust. We are legally cleared to execute the purchase agreement. William let out a slow, silent breath, releasing the crushing, suffocating tension from his lungs. A massive, euphoric wave of victory washed over him like warm water after a long, brutal winter. They had done it. They had successfully bypassed the Blind Trust. They had outsmarted and fooled a team of top-tier commercial real estate lawyers without leaving a single visible crack. They were seconds away from securing $15 million in untraceable cash. Excellent, Thorne said, pulling the bank envelope forward across the polished marble surface. He slid the $15 million cashier's check out of the protective sleeve and placed it on top of the final purchase agreement with a deliberate, ceremonial calm. "Let us sign the paperwork, William. You get your money and I get my land." William reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his expensive gold-plated fountain pen, a relic of inherited prestige he had always wielded as a prop of authority. He looked at Catherine, who was now beaming, tears of sheer relief shining brightly in her eyes like tiny diamonds. He looked at Madison, who offered him a smug, victorious wink, the quiet acknowledgement of two conspirators who believed themselves untouchable. They had completely outsmarted the system. They were the masters of the corporate universe. They were completely, absolutely untouchable. William leaned over the marble table, gripping the heavy gold pen with steady fingers. He rested his left hand on the crisp, pristine paper of the purchase agreement, smoothing out the edges with a practiced, almost theatrical gesture. He looked down at the signature line. This was the exact moment his salvation would become permanent. He brought the golden tip of the pen down toward the paper, ready to sign his name and secure the $15 million that would save his entire fraudulent empire from the rising tide of federal scrutiny. The heavy oak double doors of the boardroom suddenly exploded open with a violent, deafening crash. The heavy brass handles slammed hard against the marble walls, sending a shockwave of concussive force rippling through the dead, silent room. The sound hit like a thunderclap in a cathedral. William jumped back, his hand jerking away from the fraudulent purchase agreement, as if the paper had suddenly burst into flames. The expensive gold-plated fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the polished marble table. It rolled aimlessly in a long, indifferent arc, leaving a thin trail of dark black ink across the pristine white surface. A fragile, damning mark on everything he had built. I walked through the doorway. I was not wearing the cheap, thin wool coat from the night before. I was not the terrified, unemployed outcast who had been slapped and thrown out into the freezing Chicago winter less than 12 hours ago. I wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit like absolute armor. Every seam was precise. Every line was deliberate. My posture was perfectly straight. My chin was high. The dark bruise on my left cheekbone, where my father had struck me, was still faintly visible beneath my makeup. But I wore it not as a badge of victimhood. I wore it as a declaration of war. I was not alone. Flanking me on my right was Jonathan Pierce. The billionaire CEO of Pierce Global strode into the room with the terrifying, effortless authority of a man who owned entire city skylines. He wore a bespoke navy suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his sharp eyes scanning the boardroom with the cold, clinical detachment of a predator assessing a trapped and desperate meal. Behind us walked a specialized tactical unit of corporate warfare. 4 senior litigators from the Pierce Global Executive Legal Division marched into the room in perfect synchronization, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors in a rhythmic, ominous cadence. They carried heavy, locked leather briefcases and wore expressions of absolute, merciless intent. Men and women who had won battles far larger than this one. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, nobody in the boardroom moved a single muscle. The commercial developers sat frozen in their leather chairs, their carefully rehearsed confidence evaporating in real time. Thorne stared at Jonathan Pierce, his eyes wide with sudden, profound confusion. The look of a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was not solid. Madison dropped her green smoothie. The plastic cup hit the marble table and tipped over, sending a thick pool of bright green liquid spilling directly toward the forged release documents. She scrambled frantically to pull the papers away, letting out a high-pitched gasp of pure panic that sliced through the silence. Catherine was the first to break the paralyzing stillness. "Security!" Catherine shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. "Get corporate security up to the executive floor right this instant." She stood up so fast her heavy leather chair scraped violently against the hardwood floorboards with a grinding shriek. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with unhinged fury. "How dare you show your face in this building?" Catherine screamed, spittle flying from her lips, her composure shattered completely. "You are a convicted thief. You are a disgraced criminal. We trespassed you from this property 2 years ago. I want her arrested. Someone call the police and have this ungrateful wretch dragged out of here in handcuffs." The Pierce Global legal team did not even blink at her hysterical outburst. They simply fanned out with practiced calm, spreading across the back wall of the boardroom, effectively and silently blocking the only exit. William finally found his voice. He grabbed the edge of the marble table with both hands, trying desperately to anchor himself to reality and keep the walls of his carefully constructed world from closing in. He forced his face into a mask of aggressive corporate indignation, trying to salvage the rapidly disintegrating illusion of his authority. "Jonathan Pierce," William barked, projecting his voice from deep in his chest to mask the terrified tremor crawling underneath. "I demand to know the meaning of this unprecedented intrusion. This is a private, closed-door real estate transaction. You have absolutely no legal right to barge into my corporate headquarters. And I am utterly appalled that the CEO of a respected logistics empire would willingly associate himself with a blacklisted embezzler. That woman is a proven liability. She stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from this very company." William turned his desperate, calculating gaze toward Thorne and his legal team, trying with everything he had to contain the massive, catastrophic damage spreading across the room like a wildfire. "I sincerely apologize for this bizarre interruption, Mr. Thorne." William lied smoothly, plastering a fake, apologetic smile onto his visibly sweating face. "This is my estranged daughter. She has a documented history of severe mental instability and financial misconduct. She has been stalking our company ever since we rightfully terminated her employment. Security will have her removed immediately so we can finalize our very lucrative partnership." Thorne did not smile back. The seasoned commercial real estate developer was not an idiot. He had spent 30 years reading rooms exactly like this one, and he recognized the terrifying shift in the atmosphere with the precision of a man who had survived far too many dangerous deals to be fooled by a good performance. He looked at William's sweating forehead. He looked at the trembling hands of the Apex chief financial officer. Then he looked at the billionaire CEO standing perfectly, quietly still at the head of the table. Jonathan Pierce did not yell. He did not raise his voice to match William's frantic, aggressive tone. He did not need to. He simply walked slowly toward the center of the marble table. The sheer gravitational pull of his presence commanded absolute, total silence without asking for it. He placed his sleek black leather briefcase on the table directly beside the $15 million cashier's check. The soft, heavy thud of the leather against the stone sounded like a judge's gavel striking a block of solid wood, final and irreversible. Jonathan unbuttoned his suit jacket with one smooth motion and looked directly at the commercial developers. "Gentlemen," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerously quiet register that somehow filled every corner of the room. "I strongly advise you to pick up that cashier's check, put it back into your breast pocket, and put your checkbooks away immediately. The people sitting across from you do not have the legal authority to sign that purchase agreement. They are attempting to sell you stolen property." The words hit the boardroom like a precisely targeted missile strike. Thorne's lead attorney gasped audibly. He instantly lunged forward, grabbing the bank envelope containing the $15 million check and snatching it protectively against his chest, as if his life depended on it. His eyes darted rapidly between William and Jonathan Pierce. In commercial real estate, the mere accusation of a fraudulent title transfer, delivered by a billionaire CEO in a room full of witnesses, was more than enough to kill a deal permanently and bury everyone connected to it. "What the hell are you talking about?" Thorne demanded, standing up from his chair, his aggressive businessman's instincts flaring with immediate defensive intensity as he realized his massive tech campus project was suddenly in grave, catastrophic jeopardy. "We just reviewed the quitclaim deed. We reviewed the release forms from your own blind trust. The title is completely clear. The corporate stamps from your legal division are printed right there on page 4. Jonathan Pierce did not even glance at the forged documents resting in front of Madison. He simply offered a cold, merciless smile. "My legal division did not stamp those forms," Jonathan stated with absolute, unwavering certainty. "My legal division did not authorize a quitclaim deed. My legal division did not dissolve the blind trust, and they certainly did not release 30 acres of prime Chicago industrial real estate to a delinquent tenant who is currently 90 days past due on their commercial lease payments. Every single piece of paper sitting in front of William is a highly illegal, meticulously fabricated forgery." Thorne turned his furious, searing glare directly onto William. The developer's face hardened into a mask of pure, ruthless anger that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "You handed me forged title documents," Thorne roared, slamming his open hand down on the marble table with a crack that made every person in the room flinch. "You tried to drag my development firm into a massive felony real estate scam. Are you completely out of your mind, William? If my compliance team had processed that fraudulent title, my entire firm would be facing federal indictment for commercial fraud and money laundering." William was hyperventilating. The oxygen was rapidly leaving his lungs. His perfectly constructed $15 million escape hatch was actively, visibly burning to the ground right in front of his eyes. The desperation completely overrode his logic. He abandoned the fake aristocratic grace and resorted to pure, desperate, aggressive posturing. "That is a blatant lie," William screamed, his face turning a dark, violent shade of purple. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Jonathan Pierce. "You are trying to sabotage my company. You are trying to bankrupt Apex Distribution so you can swoop in and acquire our logistical routes for pennies on the dollar. I will not let you destroy my legacy. I will sue Pierce Global for tortious interference. I will sue you for gross defamation of character. I will sue you for corporate sabotage. I will drag you through federal civil court until you beg for a settlement." Madison jumped up from her chair, her hands trembling violently as she clutched the edge of the marble table with white-knuckled desperation. She refused to accept that her brilliant, flawless plan was collapsing around her in real time. Her arrogant entitlement blinded her completely to the massive legal freight train hurtling directly toward her at full speed. "You cannot stop this sale!" Madison shrieked, her voice echoing harshly off the glass walls. "I filed the paperwork myself. The county clerk verified the corporate stamps. The local government officially recognized the dissolution of the blind trust. We own this land. You are just a bitter old man trying to bully us because we outsmarted your massive, bureaucratic legal department. We have the verified ironclad quitclaim deed right here." Madison aggressively shoved the forged folder across the table toward Jonathan Pierce, as if the fake documents were an impenetrable magic shield capable of turning back reality itself. I did not wait for Jonathan to respond. It was my turn to deliver the execution. I stepped forward with measured, deliberate calm. I walked past the line of Pierce Global attorneys. I walked past Thorne and his panicking legal team. I walked right up to the very edge of the marble table, standing directly across from my hyperventilating father and my shrieking, entitled sister. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream to command the room. I held absolute, ultimate power. I raised my right arm. In my hand, I held a thick, heavy black leather binder. The spine was stamped with a bright red high-security legal seal, the kind that signals something ancient, unbreakable, and completely beyond the reach of forgers. It was the master portfolio of the original irrevocable blind trust established 10 years ago by the true founder of this empire. I looked William dead in the eyes. I saw the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from his pupils. I saw the devastating realization slowly creeping into the far corners of his mind. The recognition that he had severely, fatally underestimated the daughter he threw away like she was disposable. "You do not own this land, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the room like a finely sharpened blade moving through silk. I swung my arm down with all my strength. I slammed the heavy, red-stamped legal binder onto the polished marble table. The massive binder crashed down directly on top of William's forged purchase agreement and Madison's fake Pierce Global stamps with an impact that sent a shockwave through the room. The loud, explosive sound made everyone flinch simultaneously. I kept my hand pressed firmly against the leather cover, leaning my weight forward across the table. I stared into my father's terrified soul. "And I am not leaving this boardroom," I said, "until I take absolutely everything away from you. You do not own this building. You do not own the dirt beneath it. You never did." I delivered the words with a calm, icy precision that cut through the heavy air like a scalpel. I watched the absolute terror paralyze my father in real time. His hands remained frozen in the air, hovering uselessly above the forged purchase agreement he had been mere seconds away from signing. The aggressive billionaire persona he had projected just moments ago completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, sweating shell of a man. "That is impossible," William stammered, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch that bore no resemblance to the booming authority he had wielded at the start of this meeting. He looked frantically at Jonathan Pierce and then back at the red-stamped binder pinned under my hand. "My mother left me this entire enterprise. I have the corporate charters. I have the municipal tax records. I am the sole operational heir of Apex Distribution. You are bluffing. You fabricated a fake portfolio to disrupt my commercial transaction." I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice to match his panic. I simply opened the heavy leather cover of the binder. I flipped past the notarized title authentications and the federal tax compliance certificates. I found the original heavy parchment document sealed by my grandmother 10 years ago, preserved and untouched. I slid it carefully out of the protective plastic sleeve and held it up for everyone in the room to see. The vintage corporate letterhead of Apex Distribution sat proudly at the top of the page, unmistakable and irrefutable. "This is the final irrevocable addendum to the last will and testament of Beatrice," I announced, projecting my voice so that Thorne and every member of his commercial real estate legal team could hear every single devastating syllable. It was executed, registered, and locked into a high-security federal trust exactly 1 month before her death. I lowered my eyes to the paper and began to read my grandmother's final binding words aloud into the silent room. "I, Beatrice, being of sound mind and absolute authority over the assets of Apex Distribution, do hereby execute a permanent legal severance of my estate. My son, William, is greedy, arrogant, and fundamentally lacking in basic corporate discipline. I know with absolute certainty that he will eventually drive the operational side of my company into total bankruptcy. To protect the foundational wealth of this family from his inevitable incompetence, I hereby sever all commercial real estate holdings from the operational business entity." William let out a choked, gasping sound. He stumbled backward on unsteady legs, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished marble floor. He hit the edge of the floor-to-ceiling window and braced himself against the glass, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes that could no longer hide the truth. I continued reading, showing absolutely no mercy. I hereby transfer 100% of the land, the warehouses, the zoning rights, and the physical infrastructure of the Apex Distribution headquarters into a highly secured, blind trust. Jonathan Pierce will serve as the executive trustee. The sole, absolute, and unshielded beneficiary of this real estate portfolio is my granddaughter, Rachel. William will inherit the operational business, but he will never own the ground he stands on. He will pay commercial rent to the trust for the rest of his miserable life. I placed the document back down onto the marble table, directly beside Madison's forged quitclaim deed. "For 10 long years, Dad," I said, looking directly into his horrified eyes, "you have been writing massive monthly rent checks to the property management division of Pierce Global. You thought you were paying a faceless corporate landlord. You thought you were dealing with nothing more than standard commercial overhead. You had absolutely no idea that every single dollar you paid in rent was being filtered through Jonathan Pierce's accounts and deposited directly into a compounding trust bearing my name." Catherine let out a sharp, trembling cry. She covered her mouth with both hands, her diamond rings catching and scattering the boardroom lights in every direction. The reality of the situation was crashing down upon her with the weight of something enormous and unstoppable. The daughter she had starved, the daughter she had blacklisted, the daughter she had thrown out into the freezing Chicago winter, was actually the billionaire landlord of their entire failing empire. But my grandmother's brilliant financial trap was only the first half of the execution. I was not finished. I turned my attention to the stack of bright red delinquency notices sitting inside my binder. I pulled them out and tossed them casually onto the marble table, letting them scatter across William's fraudulent contracts like fallen leaves. "That brings us to your current catastrophic liquidity crisis," I stated, crossing my arms deliberately over my tailored suit. "You drained your operational budget to buy Madison a $120,000 Porsche. You drained your reserves to fund luxury vacations and high society holiday parties. Because of your reckless, unchecked greed, Apex Distribution is currently 90 days past due on its commercial lease." I looked at Thorne, who was watching the entire scene unfold with a mixture of profound shock and rising, barely contained fury. "They are in default of their master lease agreement, Mr. Thorne," I explained, shifting my gaze back to my sweating father. "As the legal owner of this property, I am officially initiating the eviction process. You have absolutely no legal standing to sell this land. You have no legal right to execute a title transfer. In fact, as of 9 o'clock this morning, you no longer have a legal right to occupy these premises at all. You are trespassing on my property." The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted with violent, instantaneous force. The commercial developers who had been sitting in stunned silence suddenly snapped into aggressive, defensive action. Thorne, a man whose entire reputation was built on ruthless efficiency and an almost supernatural ability to read danger, realized with sickening clarity how dangerously close he had come to stepping into a massive federal fraud trap. Thorne stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He reached across the marble table and aggressively snatched the bank envelope containing the $15 million cashier's check. He shoved it deep into his breast pocket, securing his funds with a decisive finality. "Pack it up," Thorne barked at his legal team, his voice reverberating off every surface in the room with absolute furious authority. "Pack every single document up right now. Do not leave a single pen behind." His lawyers scrambled with panicked speed. They shoved the purchase agreements, the title transfers, and their legal notepads into their heavy leather briefcases, snapping the brass locks shut with loud, definitive clicks. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with this radioactive crime scene, not a single fingerprint, not a single word on the record. Thorne turned his full, towering presence toward William. The commercial developer looked at my father with a level of pure, unadulterated disgust so complete it seemed to physically compress the space between them, making William shrink visibly against the window like something deflating. "You pathetic, arrogant fraud," Thorne snarled, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage that he was clearly working hard not to unleash in full. "You sat in my office last week and shook my hand. You looked me in the eye and guaranteed a clean title. You brought my top-tier legal team into this building and handed them forged documents. You tried to use my development firm to launder $15 million in stolen real estate." William raised his hands in a desperate, pleading gesture, palms out, like a man trying to stop a moving vehicle with his bare hands. "Thorne, please, you have to listen to me," William begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "We can fix this. I can negotiate with Pierce Global. I can get the title cleared. Just give me 48 hours to restructure the deal." "I will give you absolutely nothing," Thorne roared, stepping aggressively toward William until the distance between them was nothing but anger. "If my compliance team had processed that fake quitclaim deed, my entire firm would be facing federal indictment for commercial fraud and money laundering. You tried to destroy my company to cover your own bankrupt failures." Thorne adjusted his suit jacket sharply, his eyes burning with absolute contempt. "My lawyers are keeping digital copies of the forged documents you presented today," Thorne stated, his voice dropping to a cold, deliberate register. "We are handing them directly to the state prosecutor to clear our own liability. You are completely finished in this city, William. I will personally make sure every commercial investor in Chicago knows exactly what you tried to pull here today. You will never secure a single business loan again." Thorne did not wait for a response. He turned on his heel and marched out of the boardroom, his legal team trailing quickly behind him, their briefcases locked and their faces set like stone. They bypassed Jonathan Pierce and the corporate security detail without a word, walking out the heavy oak doors without once looking back. The $15 million lifeline my parents had been desperately counting on walked right out the door with them, completely and permanently vanishing forever. The boardroom plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. The reality of their absolute, total destruction finally shattered the last remaining pieces of my family's collective delusion. The money was gone. The land was mine. The state prosecutors were about to receive evidence of their real estate forgery. They had lost everything in the span of 5 agonizing minutes. Madison suddenly snapped. The golden child, the entitled chief financial officer who had never once faced a genuine consequence in her entire pampered, curated life, completely lost her mind. She could not process the fact that her luxury lifestyle, her designer clothes, and her expensive cars were vanishing into thin air like smoke. "It is a fake!" Madison screamed, her voice reaching a hysterical, ear-piercing pitch that seemed to strain the glass walls themselves. She jumped up from her leather chair, her face contorted into a mask of pure, feral rage. She pointed a shaking finger at the red-stamped binder resting on the table. "She fabricated the trust documents. She paid Jonathan Pierce to lie for her. She is a convicted thief trying to steal our money." Madison lunged across the wide marble table. She scrambled over the polished surface on her hands and knees, knocking over water glasses and scattering the forged contracts in every direction. Her hands clawed aggressively toward my face, her manicured fingernails aimed directly at my eyes. She wanted to physically tear the legal documents away from me. She wanted to destroy the evidence of her own failure with her bare hands. I did not even flinch. I stood perfectly still, every muscle in my body completely composed. Before Madison could reach the center of the table, Jonathan Pierce's corporate security detail moved with terrifying military precision. 2 large men in dark suits stepped seamlessly in front of me, forming an impenetrable human wall between Madison and everything she was trying to destroy. One of the security agents reached out and caught Madison by the shoulders, stopping her frantic forward momentum instantly. He shoved her backward with effortless, calculated force. Madison tumbled off the marble table, landing hard on the hardwood floor with a heavy, painful thud. Her designer blazer twisted awkwardly around her shoulders. She scrambled backward, hitting the base of the conference table, her breath coming in ragged, hysterical gasps. "Do not touch her!" Catherine shrieked, scrambling across the floor toward her youngest daughter. But as Catherine dropped down to help Madison up, something entirely unexpected happened. The wealthy, aristocratic matriarch, who had spent 2 years hunting me down, who had called me a toxic infection, who had ordered me out of her mansion just the night before with her chin high and her contempt blazing, looked up at me from the hardwood floor. She saw the impenetrable wall of corporate lawyers. She saw the billionaire CEO standing firmly and immovably by my side. She saw the absolute, cold, unyielding power radiating from my posture like heat from stone. Catherine realized with terrifying clarity that her aggressive threats and manipulative screams would no longer work. Not here, not anymore. The power dynamic had permanently, completely, and irreversibly reversed. Catherine's entire demeanor shifted in a fraction of a second. The arrogant, vicious monster vanished, replaced with stunning speed by a pathetic, groveling beggar. She crawled forward on her knees, her heavy silk skirt pooling around her legs on the cold floor. She reached her shaking hands out toward me, tears streaming down her carefully makeup-covered face. They were not tears of anger. They were tears of absolute, desperate terror. "Rachel, please," Catherine sobbed, her voice cracking pathetically as she knelt on the floor of the boardroom she used to rule without question. "Please, you cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We raised you. We are your flesh and blood." She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading, stripped of every weapon she had ever used against me. "You cannot evict us from this building. If you lock the doors, we will lose everything. The creditors will seize the house. We will be bankrupt. We will be out on the street. Please, Rachel, I am begging you. Show some mercy. We are your family." I looked down at my mother kneeling on the floor of the boardroom she used to rule. I looked at my father cowering against the window, shivering in his custom suit despite the warmth of the room. I looked at Madison crying hysterically against the base of the table, her perfect composure reduced to nothing. They wanted mercy. They wanted family loyalty. They wanted the very things they had violently, deliberately stripped away from me when I was freezing and starving in a rundown apartment with no prospects and no allies. I opened my mouth, ready to deliver my final, absolute rejection. I was ready to tell them to pack their boxes and get off my property without another word. But before I could speak, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open one more time. My execution was only the first wave. The second, far more devastating strike had just arrived to finish the job. I looked down at my mother still kneeling on the floor. Her tears were completely fake, manufactured with practiced precision in a desperate attempt to save her lavish lifestyle. She expected me to crumble. She expected the deep, conditioned loyalty of a daughter to override the cold, hard facts of her absolute betrayal. I did not move a single inch. I looked at her with eyes like solid ice. "I am not just evicting you," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper that somehow carried across the entire silent boardroom. "I am burying you." The heavy oak doors swung open wide. The security guards who had been blocking the exit stepped aside smoothly, clearing a path with practiced efficiency. Jamal walked into the boardroom. He was no longer the quiet, submissive son-in-law who stood in the shadows at family dinners, absorbing insults with patient, grinding silence. He was no longer the man who swallowed racist remarks to keep an uneasy peace around a table that never truly welcomed him. He walked with the terrifying, authoritative presence of a federal prosecutor stepping into a courtroom he absolutely and completely controlled. His tailored charcoal suit looked like armor. His dark eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of mercy. But Jamal did not walk into the room alone. He was flanked by 4 individuals wearing tactical windbreakers. The bold yellow letters printed across their chests read, IRSCID. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division had officially arrived. These were not civil auditors carrying calculators and spreadsheets. These were armed federal agents who specialized in dismantling massive offshore tax evasion syndicates and executing high-level corporate raids with surgical, irresistible precision. They moved with absolute military efficiency, securing the perimeter of the boardroom with quiet, practiced authority. The air in the room completely vanished. William slumped against the glass window, his legs finally giving out entirely. He slid slowly down the glass and hit the floor, staring at the federal agents with a look of pure, hollow devastation. He knew exactly what those yellow letters meant. His $12 million Cayman Island safety net had just been discovered. The illusion was entirely, permanently over. Madison, however, was still completely blinded by her own delusional entitlement. The golden child simply could not comprehend that her actions carried real, terrifying, irreversible consequences. She scrambled up from the floor, brushing the dust off her designer blazer with shaking hands. When she saw Jamal standing in the doorway, her panicked face suddenly lit up with a flash of profound, arrogant relief. She genuinely believed her husband had arrived to rescue her. She believed the brilliant tax attorney had come to bail her out of the catastrophic mess she had created and deliver her safely back to her comfortable life. "Jamal!" she screamed, running across the marble floor toward him with open arms. "Thank God you are here. Do you see what is happening? Rachel fabricated some insane legal documents to steal our land. And now these people are trying to harass us. You have to fix this. Use your legal contacts. File an injunction. Make them leave my building right now." She reached out to grab his arm, expecting him to pull her into a protective embrace, the way he had done 100 times before. Jamal stepped back abruptly. He looked at her outstretched hands with absolute, profound disgust, as if she were covered in something toxic and radioactive that he refused to let touch him. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. The sheer deadly calm of his demeanor was far more terrifying than any aggressive outburst could ever be. "Do not touch me, Madison," Jamal stated, his voice echoing off the boardroom walls with sharp, cold clarity. Madison froze, her hands hovering awkwardly in the air between them. Her eyes darted from Jamal to the grim-faced federal agent standing directly behind him. The arrogant relief began to drain from her face with visible speed, replaced by a sudden, creeping terror. "What are you talking about?" Madison stammered, her voice pitching higher with each word. "I am your wife. You are a corporate tax lawyer. You have to protect me. Tell these agents they have no jurisdiction here. Tell them we have a team of accountants who handle all of our filings." Jamal reached his left hand into his suit jacket pocket. He did not pull out a legal brief or a defense strategy. He slowly pulled his hand back out and closed his fingers into a fist. He stepped forward, walking deliberately past his panicking wife, and approached the massive marble conference table with unhurried, absolute purpose. The entire room watched in complete silence as Jamal raised his hand over the polished stone surface. He opened his fingers. A heavy platinum wedding band dropped from his palm. The ring hit the marble table with a sharp, definitive clink. The metallic sound echoed through the massive boardroom like a final, damning verdict struck by a judge with no interest in appeals. It bounced once, rolled in a tight, diminishing circle, and finally settled perfectly flat, right next to William's discarded gold fountain pen. Madison let out a sharp, trembling gasp. She stared at the platinum ring resting on the marble table, her mind utterly failing to process the reality of what she was seeing. "You forged my signature, Madison," Jamal said, his deep voice cutting through her panic with surgical, merciless precision. "You sat in your father's private study, and you digitally copied my signature from our joint marital tax return. You applied it to a binding fiduciary appointment contract. You officially designated me as the primary legal consultant responsible for all offshore tax strategy and corporate fund routing for Apex Distribution." William let out a miserable, groaning sound from his spot on the floor. Catherine buried her face in her hands and began sobbing loudly. They knew. They both knew the paper trail was absolutely, irrefutably undeniable. "You plan to use my professional credentials to legitimize your fraudulent $12 million tax evasion syndicate," Jamal continued, taking one slow, deliberate step toward his wife. "You knew the IRS would eventually audit a company bleeding this much operational cash. You needed a highly qualified scapegoat to take the fall when the federal investigators finally started examining the missing pension funds. You planned to hand those forged contracts to the authorities and send your own husband to a federal penitentiary for 20 years, just so you could keep driving your $120,000 sports car." "I did not know what those papers meant," Madison shrieked, stepping backward until her back hit the cold wall. She was openly weeping now, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "Dad told me it was just standard compliance paperwork. He said it was just a bureaucratic formality. I never meant to hurt you, Jamal. You have to believe me. I am your wife. I love you." "You do not love anyone, Madison," Jamal stated, his expression remaining completely, entirely unmoved. "You love luxury cars. You love designer clothes. You love the fake status your parents bought for you with stolen money. Last night I stood in your hallway and listened to your father call me a low-level paper pusher. I listened to him mock my background. I listened to him disrespect my entire existence. And you smiled. You told me to remember my place. You told me to stop complaining and go get a drink." Jamal shook his head slowly, a look of absolute finality settling over his sharp features like stone setting into mortar. "You told me to remember my place," Jamal repeated softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "So I did. I remembered that I am an officer of the court. I remembered that I am a highly trained federal tax attorney who knows exactly how to track illegal offshore wire transfers. I remembered that I have direct contacts within the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division." Madison's knees buckled slightly. She grabbed the edge of the nearest leather chair to keep herself from collapsing entirely to the floor. The full, devastating weight of what her husband had done was finally crashing down upon her with the force of everything she had so carelessly put in motion. "I left your lavish holiday party, Madison," Jamal said, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority that filled the room completely. "I went straight to the federal authorities. As a licensed attorney reporting an active Tier 1 felony conspiracy, I utilized the IRS Whistleblower Reward Program. I handed over every single encrypted financial file from your father's unsecured home network. I handed over the fake operational invoices, the offshore routing numbers to the Cayman Islands, and the internal emails proving you explicitly planned to forge my signature." The lead IRS agent stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. He looked at William and Catherine on the floor, then turned his stern, impassive gaze toward Madison. "We have already secured federal warrants for every single asset attached to this corporation," the agent stated, his voice loud and authoritative. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, all domestic and international bank accounts associated with Apex Distribution have been completely frozen. Your personal accounts have been frozen. Your residential estate is currently being cordoned off by federal authorities. You have absolutely zero access to any liquid capital. The financial infrastructure of the syndicate has been totally and permanently dismantled. Catherine let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She clawed at the polished marble floor, her perfectly manicured nails scraping against the stone with a horrible, desperate sound. She realized her mansion, her jewelry, her country club memberships, and her entire high society identity had literally vanished into thin air over the course of a single morning. She was completely penniless. Jamal reached into his suit jacket one final time. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and held it out toward Madison with a steady, unwavering hand. Madison stared at the envelope, her entire body shaking violently. She did not want to take it. She knew, with the last functioning part of her mind that was still connected to reality, exactly what it was. Her perfect, wealthy, arrogant life had been entirely, systematically dismantled in less than 24 hours. "Take it," Jamal ordered, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or delay. Madison slowly raised her trembling hand and took the manila envelope from his grasp. She clutched it against her chest and sobbed uncontrollably, her designer clothes now absurdly out of place against the backdrop of federal agents and the ruins of everything she had counted on. "Those are your divorce papers," Jamal said, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit with calm precision. "I have already filed them with the county clerk. I am officially severing all legal and financial ties to you and this entirely corrupt family. I have secured full federal immunity for my cooperation in this investigation. You, however, do not have immunity. You are the chief financial officer of a company that just committed massive federal tax fraud and grand larceny. Your signature is on the fraudulent tax returns. Your signature is on the embezzled pension fund transfers." Jamal looked at her one last time. All the warmth, all the love, all the loyalty, every soft and human thing that had once lived between them, completely drained from his eyes until there was nothing left. "Have fun in federal prison, CFO," Jamal said quietly. He turned his back on her and walked away from the terrified, sobbing wreck of the woman he used to love. He walked with steady, unhurried steps to where I was standing beside Jonathan Pierce. Jamal gave me a single, firm nod of solidarity. The alliance we had forged in that dark, greasy diner the night before had worked with flawless, devastating precision. We had executed a perfectly synchronized strike against the people who had tried to destroy us both, and they never saw it coming. The federal agents moved forward with decisive purpose. The lead agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic rattling sound filled the boardroom, drowning out Catherine's pathetic wailing and William's defeated, hollow groans. "William, Catherine, and Madison," the agent announced, pulling out a thick stack of federal arrest warrants. "You are hereby under arrest for conspiracy to commit tax evasion, corporate fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The agents hauled William up from the floor, yanking his arms behind his back. The billionaire patriarch did not fight back. He did not scream. He simply let the agents secure the steel cuffs around his wrists, his eyes staring blankly at the floor as though looking at something very far away. He was completely, utterly broken, a man who had finally run out of room to run. Catherine fought the agents, kicking and screaming as they pulled her up from the marble floor. She shrieked about her social standing, demanding they release her, threatening to call the mayor with the absolute certainty of a woman who had never once faced real consequences. The agents ignored her hysterical threats expertly, securing her wrists with practiced efficiency and pushing her firmly toward the heavy oak doors. Madison just stood there, clutching the manila envelope containing her divorce papers against her chest. She let the federal agent turn her around and place the handcuffs on her wrists without resistance. the shiny metal locked securely right next to her expensive diamond bracelet. The two objects side by side like a summary of everything she had chosen and everything it had cost her. The reality of her situation had finally broken her arrogant delusion clean in half. The golden child was going to a federal penitentiary. I stood in the center of the boardroom and watched the federal agents march my family out the doors. I felt absolutely nothing for them. No grief, no guilt, no residual pull of blood loyalty. The deep, painful wounds they had inflicted on me over the years, the blacklisting, the starvation, the physical assault, were finally, completely healed. I had taken back my life. I had taken back my power. I had buried them. And the best part was that I was only just getting started. The federal agents did not treat my family with the gentle, aristocratic respect they were accustomed to receiving in every room they had ever entered. When Madison tried to pull away, clutching her designer handbag against her chest with desperate, white-knuckled fingers, the female IRS agent stepped in with swift, uncompromising authority. The agent grabbed the expensive leather handle and yanked the bag cleanly out of Madison's desperate grip. The bag was immediately dropped into a heavy plastic evidence sack and sealed with a bright red federal tag. The sound of that zipper closing had a finality to it that no amount of money could undo. Madison broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Her knees buckled under the weight of her new reality. She was no longer a wealthy corporate executive. She was a federal suspect being methodically stripped of her stolen armor, piece by piece. William watched his golden child collapse. The sight finally shattered the last remaining fragment of his ego, the final illusion he had been clinging to through all of this. He turned his head, looking back over his shoulder as the agent shoved him toward the heavy oak doors. His eyes locked onto mine. The arrogance, the booming voice, the billionaire facade, all of it was entirely, irreversibly gone. He was nothing but a terrified old man facing the absolute ruin he had spent decades engineering with his own hands. "Rachel, please," William begged, his voice cracking as he strained against the steel handcuffs. "You have to stop this. You are my daughter. You can talk to Pierce. You can talk to the authorities. Tell them we can make a deal. We can give you the operational business. We can give you everything. Just call them off, Rachel. Please do not let them do this to your own family." I stood beside Jonathan Pierce, my posture perfectly rigid, my expression carved from solid ice. I looked at the man who had slapped me across the face less than 12 hours ago. I looked at the man who had actively hunted down my job applications and deliberately starved me of every opportunity to protect his own greed. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I made sure my voice was loud enough for every single person remaining in the boardroom to hear every word with perfect clarity. "To whom it may concern," I stated, quoting exactly, word for word, the email he had sent to destroy my life. "My parents are thieves. Do not hire them." William let out a wretched, sobbing gasp. It was the sound of total, ultimate defeat. The sound of a man hearing his own weapon turned back on him with perfect precision. The federal agents pushed him forward, forcing him out of the boardroom and down the long corridor. Catherine followed behind him, wailing hysterically about her ruined reputation and the life she would never get back. Madison trailed at the back, clutching her empty, handcuffed wrists against the manila envelope that held the final documentation of everything she had lost. The heavy boardroom doors swung shut behind them, sealing their fate and silencing their pathetic cries forever. 1 month later, the toxic empire of Apex Distribution was completely, officially eradicated from the Chicago Business Registry. The speed of the federal investigation was breathtaking in its thoroughness. Armed with Jamal's immaculate, unencrypted data, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division froze every single domestic and offshore account tied to the family within 72 hours. The sprawling suburban mansion in Oak Brook was seized by the federal government. The luxury cars were impounded and auctioned off to satisfy the massive restitution fines. William, Catherine, and Madison were denied bail due to the severe flight risk posed by their Cayman Island connections. They sat in federal holding cells, awaiting a trial they had absolutely no hope of winning. With the operational entity completely bankrupt and seized by federal authorities, I finally took total, unshielded control of my inheritance. The 30 acres of prime commercial real estate belonged exclusively to me. I did not sell the land to the commercial developers. I did not take a quick cash payout and walk away. I had a much larger, far more ambitious vision. I utilized the massive capital reserves sitting inside my blind trust to completely renovate and modernize the warehouses. I stripped away the outdated, failing infrastructure my father had neglected and mismanaged for years. In its place, I built a state-of-the-art, highly automated supply chain hub designed for the demands of the next decade. I founded my own independent corporation, naming it Vanguard Logistics. I was no longer just an internal auditor or a mid-level analyst begging for an interview in lobby after lobby. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar enterprise, and every decision in it was mine to make. Jonathan Pierce did not simply serve as my former trustee, he became my most powerful strategic partner. Pierce Global possessed a massive international shipping network, but they needed a modernized, centralized distribution hub in the Midwest to streamline their ground operations and reduce their overhead. Vanguard Logistics provided the exact infrastructure they required, and I had built it from the ground up. We executed an exclusive, highly lucrative partnership agreement. I integrated my newly renovated warehouses directly into the Pierce Global supply chain network. The merger of our assets instantly elevated my new firm into the top tier of the Chicago logistics industry. My revenue projections for the first quarter alone surpassed everything my father had managed to generate in 5 years of mismanagement and theft. I stood in my new executive suite on the top floor of the newly rebranded Vanguard Logistics headquarters. The office was designed to my exact specifications: sleek, modern glass walls, minimal metallic accents, and a massive mahogany desk that commanded the room without overwhelming it. It was a space built entirely on competence and integrity, not inherited arrogance. A soft knock sounded at the glass door. Jamal walked into my office. He looked completely different from the quiet, suppressed man I had known for the past 2 years. Different in the way that someone looks when they have finally put down something heavy they have been carrying for too long. He wore a sharp, tailored navy suit, but the heavy, suffocating tension he had always carried around my family was entirely absent from his shoulders. His posture was relaxed, confident, and freely his own. "The divorce was finalized this morning," Jamal announced, offering a genuine, bright smile as he walked toward my desk. "The judge granted the absolute dissolution. I am officially, completely free of them." I smiled back, feeling a profound sense of shared, well-earned victory settle warmly in my chest. "Congratulations, Jamal. That is the best news I have heard all day." He took a seat in the leather chair across from my desk. "The federal prosecutors offered me a very lucrative position in their financial crimes division," Jamal said, leaning back comfortably. "They were highly impressed with the digital dossier we built. They said it was the most comprehensive, airtight evidence package they had seen in a decade." I raised an eyebrow and leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "And did you accept their offer?" Jamal let out a low, rich laugh. "I told them I already had a much better offer on the table." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick, crisp legal contract. I slid it across the smooth surface toward him. The document was a formal executive employment agreement. "Vanguard Logistics needs a chief compliance officer," I stated, my tone shifting into a professional but genuinely warm register. We are handling massive operational contracts for Pierce Global. We are routing millions of dollars in international supply chain assets. I need someone who knows the federal tax code inside and out. I need someone whose integrity is absolutely bulletproof. I need someone I can trust with my life. Jamal picked up the contract. He read the title and the compensation package. His eyes widened slightly at the generous equity stake I had included in the offer. He looked up at me, his dark eyes filled with profound mutual respect. You and I dismantled a corrupt empire in 24 hours from a dirty booth in a roadside diner, Jamal said, his voice steady and full of quiet conviction. Imagine what we can build with a multi-million-dollar infrastructure and absolute legal authority. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a silver pen, and signed his name on the bottom line with a sharp, decisive stroke. I stood up and walked over to the small crystal decanter resting on a side table. I poured 2 glasses of premium-aged bourbon and walked back, handing one to my new chief compliance officer. Jamal stood, taking the glass. We raised our drinks, holding them up in the bright morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. To Vanguard Logistics, Jamal said. To Chosen Family, I replied. We clinked our glasses together. The clear, sharp sound rang beautifully in the spacious office, clean and resonant and entirely our own. We took a sip, letting the smooth warmth of the bourbon seal our new, unbreakable alliance. A week later, I was standing by the massive glass windows of my corner office, looking out over the sprawling, magnificent Chicago skyline. The city that had once felt like a frozen, hostile prison, a place where every door closed in my face, now felt like my personal kingdom, intimate and vast at the same time. My name was no longer a toxic liability. It was a highly respected brand. The business world moves fast, but gossip moves faster. Forbes magazine had just published a massive feature article detailing the catastrophic collapse of Apex Distribution and the subsequent rapid rise of Vanguard Logistics. The article highlighted my strategic partnership with Jonathan Pierce and my transition from a blacklisted auditor to a logistics titan who had built an empire from the ruins of the one designed to destroy her. My face was printed across a full-page spread, looking powerful, unbothered, and victorious. The sleek black phone on my desk began to ring. I walked over and picked up the receiver. Vanguard Logistics. Rachel speaking, I answered, my voice smooth and professional. Rachel. Oh, thank goodness I finally got through to your direct line. A panicked, breathless voice came through on the other end. This is Thomas Bradley. I am the Senior Hiring Manager at Zenith Supply Chain Solutions. I paused, recognizing the name instantly. Zenith was the very first company I had applied to 2 years ago, in the desperate first weeks after my parents fired me. Thomas Bradley was the exact hiring manager who had laughed in my face, thrown my resume in the trash, and had security escort me out of his building after receiving my mother's defamatory email, without asking a single question or giving me a single moment to speak. Hello, Thomas, I said, my voice turning dangerously cold. What can I do for you? Rachel, I was just reading the Forbes feature this morning, Thomas stammered, his tone dripping with desperate, obsequious flattery. I was absolutely blown away by your strategic acquisition of the Apex infrastructure. We are currently looking for a senior vice president of operations here at Zenith. We are prepared to offer a highly competitive compensation package, 7 figures, full benefits, a massive signing bonus. We would love to bring a visionary like you onto our executive board. He was sweating. I could hear it clearly in his voice, the thin edge of panic underneath every carefully chosen word. He had realized, finally and far too late, that he had burned a bridge with a woman who was now completely out of his league. He was desperately trying to salvage his own terrible judgment with flattery he had never once offered when it might have actually mattered. I looked down at the Forbes magazine resting open on my mahogany desk. I looked at the glossy photograph of myself. I thought about the days I had spent eating canned food alone in a cold apartment, terrified of being evicted. All because men like Thomas Bradley had refused to conduct even the most basic background check on the accusations sent to destroy me. "I am highly flattered by the generous offer, Thomas," I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite but utterly lethal beneath the surface. "Oh, excellent." He breathed a heavy sigh of relief that echoed through the receiver. "When can we schedule a sit-down to discuss the terms?" "You misunderstand me, Thomas," I stated firmly, cutting off his pathetic excitement before it could travel another inch. "I said I was flattered. I did not say I was interested. When I walked into your office 2 years ago, you called me a criminal. You did not ask for my side of the story. You did not run an independent audit. You took the word of a corrupt regime because it was convenient and required nothing of you." "Rachel, please, I had no idea," Thomas pleaded, his voice shrinking into a pathetic whine. "The email came directly from the CEO of Apex. I was just following standard industry protocol." "Standard industry protocol requires due diligence," I replied, my voice dropping to a final, quiet whisper that left no room for a response. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I do not work for people who do not verify their facts." I did not wait for his sputtering apologies. I placed the phone receiver firmly back onto its cradle, cutting the connection entirely and completely. I turned away from the desk and walked back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I picked up my ceramic mug and took a long, slow sip of hot black coffee. I looked out over the glittering metallic skyline of the city. The sky was perfectly clear. The winter sun shone brightly, reflecting off the endless expanse of glass and steel with a brilliance that felt almost deliberate, as if the city itself had decided, finally, to show me what it looked like when the light came all the way in. My parents were locked in federal holding cells. My sister had lost her fake crown. My career was completely, entirely bulletproof. It was a complete, absolute, untouchable victory. Rachel's journey reveals a profound lesson. True power against toxic family members lies in quiet preparation and absolute independence, not in begging for their validation or fighting on their terms. When her parents destroyed her career, she didn't waste energy screaming at their lies. Instead, Rachel meticulously built her own empire and secured ironclad legal boundaries that could not be forged, stolen, or taken away. She proved that sharing DNA does not entitle anyone to abuse you. Real vindication happens when you stop seeking their approval and let your undeniable success dismantle their illusions more thoroughly than any argument ever could. Take control of your own narrative today and build a foundation they cannot touch. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to rebuild your life? Share your story in the comments below.